Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Officer Declan Morrissey had been working the night shift in Brooklyn's 79th Precinct for 8 years, and in that time, he had developed the kind of relationship with the darkness that most people never understand. The hours between midnight and 6 in the morning belonged to a different version of the city, one that operated according to rules that daylight obscured. He knew which blocks would be empty and which would pulse with activity that existed in the margins of legality. He knew the sounds that meant trouble and the silences that meant something worse. He had learned to read the night the way other officers read faces, interpreting shadows and movement and the quality of emptiness that filled the streets when honest people were asleep in their beds. His patrol route took him through the industrial sections of Bedford-Stuyvesant, along Atlantic Avenue where warehouses stood like monuments to a manufacturing economy that had long since moved elsewhere, and down into the residential streets where brownstones pressed together in tight rows that had housed generations of families trying to build lives in a city that demanded everything and promised nothing in return. Morrissey drove these streets with his windows cracked open despite the November cold, listening to the city breathe around him. The radio chatter from dispatch provided a constant background rhythm, calls going out to other units responding to domestics and noise complaints and suspicious persons, the routine catalog of human conflict that filled the overnight hours. His partner had called in sick that evening, leaving Morrissey to work solo, which he preferred anyway. There was a meditative quality to being alone in a patrol car with nothing but the city and the radio and the knowledge that anything could happen in the next moment. It was just after 2 in the morning when Morrissey turned onto the stretch of Atlantic Avenue that ran beneath the elevated train tracks, a corridor of perpetual shadow even during daylight hours. The streetlights here were sparse and half of them were burned out, leaving pools of darkness between islands of sickly yellow illumination. Traffic was non-existent at this hour. The businesses that lined the avenue were closed and gated, their metal security shutters covered in graffiti that constituted a visual history of the neighborhood's evolving gang territories and street art movements. Morrissey drove slowly, his headlights cutting through the gloom, scanning the sidewalks for anything out of place. That was when he saw the car. It was a dark sedan, possibly black or deep blue, difficult to determine in the inadequate lighting. It was parked in a loading zone in front of a closed furniture warehouse, its engine running, exhaust vapor visible in the cold air. The vehicle's lights were off. Morrissey slowed his patrol car as he approached, reaching for his radio to call in a vehicle check. Before he could key the mic, the sedan's brake lights flashed once and it pulled away from the curb, accelerating smoothly down Atlantic Avenue. Morrissey followed at a distance, not pursuing but maintaining visual contact. The sedan was not speeding or driving erratically. It simply moved through the empty streets with purpose, taking the turn onto Rochester Avenue and heading north toward the residential blocks. Morrissey activated his spotlight and aimed it at the sedan's rear plate as they drove. The numbers and letters jumped out clearly in the harsh white beam. New York plate, 7 characters, HNK 4739. He committed it to memory and called it in to dispatch, asking for a registration check. Dispatcher Irene Calloway's voice came back within 30 seconds with the results. The plate returned to a 2014 Honda Accord registered to an address in Queens. No wants or warrants associated with the vehicle. No reports of it being stolen. Everything appeared legitimate. The sedan continued north on Rochester, its driving steady and unremarkable. Morrissey considered pulling it over simply to check on the driver's welfare, since it was unusual to see someone parked in a loading zone at 2 a.m. with their lights off. But the vehicle had not committed any traffic violations, and there was no legal justification for a stop. He watched as the sedan turned east onto Herkimer Street and disappeared from view. Morrissey returned to his patrol route, filing the encounter away as one of thousands of minor incidents that filled his nights, meaningless in isolation, but contributing to his accumulated knowledge of the neighborhood's patterns and rhythms. 3 hours later, just before his shift ended at 6, Morrissey was driving west on Atlantic Avenue, heading back toward the precinct to complete his paperwork. The sky was beginning to lighten with the gray promise of dawn. The early morning delivery trucks were starting their rounds, and a few commuters were emerging from apartment buildings to begin their journeys to work. As Morrissey passed beneath the elevated tracks again, he saw a dark sedan parked in the same loading zone where he had seen the vehicle hours earlier. Engine running, exhaust visible, lights off. Morrissey pulled up behind it and activated his spotlight. The license plate was clearly visible in the beam. HNK 4739. The same vehicle, or at least the same plate number, in the same location where he had found it before. Morrissey felt a small pulse of curiosity mixed with suspicion. He exited his patrol car and approached the sedan on foot, his hand resting near his service weapon as procedure dictated. As he drew closer, he could see through the rear window that the driver's seat appeared to be occupied. Someone was sitting behind the wheel. Morrissey tapped on the driver's window with his flashlight. The figure inside did not respond. Morrissey tapped again, harder this time, and called out that he was police and needed the driver to roll down the window. Still no response. The figure remained motionless. Morrissey tried the door handle and found it unlocked. He opened the door carefully, prepared for any sudden movement from the occupant. The driver's seat was empty. No one was there. Morrissey stood in the open doorway, his flashlight illuminating the sedan's interior, trying to reconcile what he had clearly seen through the window with the reality of the empty seat. The engine was running, the keys in the ignition, but there was no driver. Morrissey checked the back seat and found it empty as well. He looked around the immediate area, thinking the driver might have exited the vehicle and walked away in the few seconds between when Morrissey had seen the figure and when he had opened the door. The sidewalk was empty in both directions. No pedestrians, no movement, nothing. Morrissey radioed dispatch and reported that he had found an unoccupied vehicle running with the keys in the ignition at the Atlantic Avenue location. He requested a tow truck and began the process of documenting the abandoned vehicle. As he walked around the sedan taking photographs and notes, he tried to make sense of what he had seen. The human mind could play tricks in poor lighting, especially after a long shift when fatigue blurred perception. He might have seen a headrest or a shadow and interpreted it as a person. It was the most rational explanation, and Morrissey was a rational man who did not believe in allowing imagination to interfere with police work. The tow truck arrived 40 minutes later and removed the sedan. Morrissey completed his shift, turned in his paperwork, and drove home through the morning traffic to his apartment in Sunset Park. He slept through the day as he always did, his blackout curtains transforming noon into midnight, and woke in the early evening to prepare for another night shift. He ate dinner, showered, put on his uniform, and reported for duty at 11:30, ready to begin the cycle again. That night, Morrissey's regular partner, Officer Ronan Pike, was back on duty after recovering from whatever flu or cold had kept him home the previous evening. Pike was 10 years younger than Morrissey, still enthusiastic about the work in a way that Morrissey remembered being, but could no longer access. They had been partnered for 2 years, and had developed the easy camaraderie that came from spending 8 hours a night in close quarters, driving through the same streets, responding to the same calls, building a shared vocabulary of inside jokes and references that made the work bearable. "Anything interesting happen last night?" Pike asked, as they pulled out of the precinct parking lot to begin their patrol. "Found an abandoned vehicle on Atlantic," Morrissey said. "Engine running, no driver, towed it in." "Stolen?" Pike asked. "Registration came back clean. Probably someone's car broke down and they walked away to get help. Forgot to turn it off." Pike nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and they continued their patrol. The night unfolded according to the usual pattern. They responded to a noise complaint at an apartment building on Fulton Street, where a party was still going strong at 1 in the morning. They broke up a fight outside a bodega on Nostrand Avenue, where two men were arguing over a woman who had apparently left with a third man while they were busy posturing. They assisted an elderly woman who had locked herself out of her apartment and waited with her until a locksmith arrived. These were the routine incidents that filled their shifts, human dramas playing out on a small scale while the city's larger machinery continued to turn. At 3:15 in the morning, Morrissey and Pike were driving south on Rochester Avenue when Morrissey saw the sedan again. It was parked on the street outside a row of brownstones, engine running, lights off. Even before he activated his spotlight to check the plate, Morrissey knew what he would see. HNK 4739. "That's the vehicle I found abandoned last night," Morrissey said, pulling the patrol car to a stop behind the sedan. Pike looked at the vehicle through the windshield. "You sure?" "Same plate. I called it in, remember? Honda Accord, registered in Queens." They both exited the patrol car and approached the sedan. As they drew closer, Morrissey could see through the rear window that the driver's seat appeared to be occupied again. A figure sat behind the wheel, motionless. Morrissey felt something cold settle in his stomach, a sensation he had learned over the years to recognize as his instinct warning him that a situation was not what it appeared to be. "You see someone in there?" Pike asked, his voice dropping to the quiet tone they used when approaching potentially dangerous situations. "I see something," Morrissey said. He tapped on the driver's window with his flashlight. No response. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked, just as it had been the previous night. He opened the door and shined his flashlight into the interior. The driver's seat was empty, just as it had been before. Pike moved to the passenger side and opened that door, checking the interior from his angle. "No one here," he said, confusion evident in his voice. Morrissey stood by the open driver's door, looking at the empty seat where he had clearly seen a figure sitting just moments before. Pike was looking at him, waiting for an explanation that Morrissey could not provide. The engine was running. The keys were in the ignition. The radio was playing quietly, some late-night talk show about conspiracy theories and government cover-ups. The interior of the car smelled faintly of cigarettes and air freshener, the scent of human occupation. "Maybe the owner lives in one of these buildings," Pike suggested. "Could have gone inside and left the car running to keep it warm." It was a reasonable theory. Morrissey checked the registration address again on his mobile data terminal. The vehicle was registered to a residence in Forest Hills, Queens, not Brooklyn. But that did not mean the owner could not have been visiting someone in this neighborhood. People left their cars running all the time in the winter, especially in residential areas where they felt safe doing so. Morrissey walked to the nearest brownstone and tried the outer door. It was locked, as expected. He could see the buzzers for 6 different apartments. He had no legal authority to start buzzing random apartments at 3 in the morning to ask if anyone owned a Honda Accord with the plate HNK 4739. They could document the running vehicle and call for a tow, but that seemed excessive if the owner was simply inside visiting someone. "Let's shut it off and leave a note," Pike said. "If the owner comes back and can't find it, they can call the precinct." Morrissey reached into the sedan and turned the key, shutting off the engine. The sudden silence felt weighted, as though something important had been interrupted. He wrote a brief note on a page from his citation book, explaining that police had found the vehicle running unattended and had shut it off for safety reasons, and left his contact information. He tucked the note under the windshield wiper and returned to the patrol car. As they drove away, Morrissey looked back at the sedan through his side mirror. It sat dark and silent beneath the streetlight, just another parked car on a street full of parked cars. But he could not shake the image of that figure he had seen through the window, the solid certainty that someone had been sitting in the driver's seat, and the equally solid reality of the empty seat when he opened the door. "You okay?" Pike asked. "You seem distracted." "Just tired," Morrissey said. "Long week." The rest of the shift passed without incident. They completed their patrol, responded to a few more calls, and returned to the precinct as dawn broke over the city. Morrissey filed his paperwork, including a brief note about the running vehicle on Rochester Avenue, and went home to sleep. But his sleep was troubled. He dreamed of driving through empty streets, following a dark sedan that always stayed just ahead of him, its license plate clearly visible but somehow changing each time he tried to read it. In the dream, he knew he needed to stop the vehicle, that something important depended on it. But no matter how fast he drove, he could never close the distance. The sedan led him through a Brooklyn that was familiar and alien at once. Streets he recognized transformed into mazes that looped back on themselves, until he was no longer sure if he was chasing the vehicle or if it was leading him somewhere he did not want to go. He woke in the afternoon with the dream still vivid in his mind, disturbing in a way he could not articulate. He tried to dismiss it as the natural result of an unusual encounter combined with the fatigue, but the unease lingered as he prepared for another night shift. He told himself that he would not see the sedan again, that it had been coincidence, nothing more. The city held millions of people and thousands of streets. The odds of encountering the same vehicle multiple times were actually higher than they seemed, a function of patrol routes and timing that created patterns out of random events. But when he reported for duty that evening and climbed into the patrol car with Pike, Morrissey found himself watching for that dark sedan, scanning every parked vehicle, checking every license plate. And part of him, a part he tried to ignore, knew that he would see it again. Not because of statistics or probability, but because something had been set in motion that night when he first spotted the vehicle parked in the loading zone beneath the elevated tracks. Something that had not yet finished with him. The sedan appeared again on the fourth night. This time, Morrissey was alone in the patrol car. Pike had taken a personal day to attend his sister's wedding in New Jersey, leaving Morrissey to work solo once more. The solitude felt heavier now, weighted with an anticipation that Morrissey tried to rationalize a simple curiosity about whether he would encounter the vehicle again. He told himself it was nothing more than the human tendency to see patterns where none existed, to construct narratives out of coincidence. But when he turned onto Atlantic Avenue at 2:40 in the morning and saw the dark sedan parked beneath the elevated tracks in that same loading zone, he felt no surprise at all. Only a sick sense of confirmation that settled in his chest like cold water. He pulled up behind the vehicle and sat in his patrol car for a long moment before calling it in. The sedan's engine was running. He could see the exhaust vapor rising in the cone of his headlights. The plate was clearly visible without even using his spotlight. HNK 4739. He picked up his radio and called dispatch, already knowing what Irene Calloway would tell him before she spoke. 79 Adam to Central, Morrissey said, keeping his voice level and professional. "Go ahead, 79 Adam." Calloway's voice came back immediately. She had been working dispatch at the 79th for 12 years, longer than Morrissey had been on the force, and her calm efficiency was one of the constants that made the chaos of night shift manageable. "I've got a vehicle check. New York plate, Henry, November Kilo 4739. I'm at Atlantic and Rochester. Vehicle is parked in a loading zone with the engine running. No visible occupants. There was a brief pause while Calloway ran the query. Morrissey waited, watching the sedan through his windshield. The street was empty in both directions. No pedestrians, no other vehicles. Just the sedan and his patrol car and the darkness pressing in from all sides. 79 Adam. That plate returns to a 2014 Honda Accord. Registered owner is a male subject. Address in Forest Hills, Queens. No wants, no warrants, no stolen vehicle reports. You want me to try the registered owner's phone number? Morrissey considered this. The department had access to contact information for registered vehicle owners, and in situations where a vehicle appeared abandoned or was involved in an incident, dispatchers could attempt to reach the owner, but something made him hesitate. He was not sure what he would say if the owner answered. Your car keeps appearing in my patrol sector with the engine running and no one inside, and I keep seeing someone in the driver's seat who disappears when I get close. It sounded insane, even in his own head. Negative, Central. I'm going to check the vehicle. Stand by. Copy, 79 Adam. Standing by. Morrissey exited his patrol car and approached the sedan, his flashlight in one hand and his other hand instinctively resting on his service weapon. The night air was cold enough to make his breath visible. The city sounds were muted here beneath the elevated tracks, as though the steel structure above absorbed the noise and left only a hollow silence. As he drew closer to the sedan, he could see through the rear window into the interior. The driver's seat appeared to be occupied. A figure sat behind the wheel, facing forward, motionless. Morrissey's heart rate increased. He could feel it in his throat, a steady pulse that seemed too fast for the situation. This was just a parked car, nothing more. But his body was reacting as though he were approaching an armed suspect or an active crime scene, flooding his system with adrenaline that made his hands steady and his senses sharpen. He tapped on the driver's window with his flashlight, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet street. The figure did not move. Morrissey could see it clearly now through the glass. It had the general shape of a person, head and shoulders visible above the seatback, but there was something wrong with the proportions. The head seemed too large or the shoulders too narrow. The details were obscured by the poor lighting and the angle, but Morrissey's instincts were screaming that what he was looking at was not quite right. He tried the door handle. Unlocked, just as before. He pulled the door open, his flashlight beam flooding the interior with harsh white light. The driver's seat was empty. Not just empty, but clearly empty. No person, no objects, nothing that could have created the illusion of a figure from outside. The seat was pushed back as though set for a tall driver. The steering wheel was straight. Everything looked normal except for the fact that someone should have been sitting there and was not. Morrissey stood with the door open, his flashlight illuminating the empty interior, and felt the first real stirrings of fear. Not the adrenaline fear that came from facing physical danger, but something deeper and more primitive. The fear that came from encountering something that violated the basic rules of reality, that suggested the world operated according to principles he did not understand. He checked the back seat, the floor, even the trunk after popping it open with the interior release. The vehicle was completely empty. He returned to his patrol car and radioed dispatch again. Central, 79 Adam. Vehicle is unoccupied, engine running, keys in the ignition. This is the same vehicle I've documented on 3 previous occasions in the past 4 days. Different locations, but same plate number. I'm requesting a supervisor to the scene. There was a longer pause this time. Morrissey could hear Calloway typing on her computer, probably pulling up his previous reports. When she came back on the radio, her voice carried a note of curiosity that had not been there before. Copy, 79 Adam. Sergeant Quinn is en route to your location. ETA 8 minutes. Morrissey returned to the sedan and conducted a more thorough search while he waited. He opened the glove compartment and found the registration and insurance documents, both current and apparently legitimate. The name on the registration was listed as Michael Voss, with an address on Burn Street in Forest Hills. Morrissey photographed the documents with his phone. He checked under the seats and found nothing but some loose change and an old parking receipt. The trunk contained a spare tire and the emergency kit. Everything was normal, ordinary, exactly what one would expect to find in a daily driver vehicle. Sergeant Maura Quinn arrived 7 minutes later in her patrol SUV, pulling up alongside Morrissey's car. Quinn had been with the 79th for 16 years and had worked her way up through the ranks with a combination of solid police work and political savvy that Morrissey respected even if he did not fully understand it. She was in her mid-40s, compact and fit, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. She exited her vehicle and walked over to where Morrissey stood beside the sedan. "This is the mystery vehicle?" Quinn asked, looking at the Honda with an expression that suggested she was not particularly impressed. "Fourth time I've encountered it in 4 days," Morrissey said. "Different locations each time, but always the same circumstances. Engine running, appears to be occupied from outside, empty when I check." Quinn walked around the sedan, looking through the windows, checking the plate. "You're sure it's the same vehicle each time? Not just the same make and model?" "Same plate number, HNK 4739. I've documented it every time." Quinn pulled out her phone and made a call. Morrissey could hear her side of the conversation as she spoke to someone at the precinct, probably the night shift commander, explaining the situation and requesting guidance. After a few minutes, she ended the call and turned back to Morrissey. "We're going to impound it. Captain wants it brought in and thoroughly searched. If this vehicle is connected to something criminal, we need to document everything properly. If it's not, then the owner can come pick it up and explain why his car keeps being found abandoned all over Brooklyn." Quinn called for a tow truck while Morrissey completed the impound paperwork. They waited together in the cold, watching the sedan as though expecting it to do something, though neither of them could have said what. The tow truck arrived 30 minutes later, and they watched as the driver hooked up the Honda and lifted it onto the flatbed. As the sedan was raised off the ground, its wheels hanging in the air, Morrissey felt an irrational sense of relief, as though removing the vehicle from the street would break whatever pattern had been developing. "You look tired," Quinn said as the tow truck pulled away with the sedan. "When's your last day off?" "Had one 3 days ago," Morrissey said. "Take another one tomorrow. That's not a request. You're coming up on overtime limits anyway, and I don't need you falling asleep on patrol." Morrissey wanted to argue, but Quinn was right. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond the normal fatigue of working nights. The encounter with the sedan had left him feeling drained, as though something had been pulled out of him each time he approached that vehicle and found it empty. He nodded his agreement. "Good. File your report when you get back to the house, then go home. I'll handle the vehicle inspection personally tomorrow and let you know what we find." Morrissey returned to the precinct and spent an hour writing a detailed report that documented all 4 encounters with the Honda, including dates, times, locations, and the circumstances of each incident. He described seeing what appeared to be a figure in the driver's seat and finding the seat empty upon investigation. He included the registration information and his attempts to rationalize the experiences. When he was finished, the report read like something out of a paranormal investigation rather than standard police documentation, but it was accurate, and that was what mattered. He submitted the report electronically and drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, the city gradually coming to life around him as early commuters began their journeys to work. He lived in a 4th-floor walk-up apartment on 58th Street in Sunset Park. a neighborhood that had been slowly gentrifying over the past decade, pushing out long-time residents and replacing bodegas with artisanal coffee shops. Morrissey had lived there for 6 years, in the same one-bedroom apartment with the same second-hand furniture and the same view of the building across the street. It was not much, but it was his. A space that belonged to him alone after 8 hours of belonging to the city and everyone in it. He showered and ate a simple breakfast of eggs and toast, then closed the blackout curtains and climbed into bed. Sleep came quickly, but brought no rest. He dreamed again of the sedan, but this time the dream was more vivid, more detailed. He was approaching the vehicle on foot, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than normal air. When he reached the driver's window and looked inside, he could see the figure sitting behind the wheel. But in the dream, the figure turned to look at him, and Morrissey saw that it had his own face. His face, but wrong somehow, the features slightly distorted as though seen through rippled glass. The figure that wore his face smiled at him, and Morrissey felt a terror so profound that he woke gasping, his heart hammering in his chest. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to return to sleep. The dream had felt less like a dream and more like a message, though he could not have explained what the message was or who it came from. He got up and spent the rest of the day trying to distract himself with television and internet browsing, but his mind kept returning to the sedan and the figure he had seen through the window. By the time evening arrived and he needed to prepare for his next shift, he was dreading the night ahead with an intensity that surprised him. But he had taken Quinn's order seriously and called in to use one of his accumulated days off. The dispatcher who answered confirmed his leave and told him to enjoy his time away from work. Morrissey spent the evening in his apartment, pacing and restless, unable to settle into the relaxation that a day off should have provided. He considered calling Pike to ask if anything unusual had happened during the shift, but decided against it. What would he say? "Did you see the ghost car that keeps following me?" It sounded ridiculous. At midnight, when he would normally have been starting his patrol, Morrissey found himself driving through Brooklyn in his personal vehicle. A 10-year-old Nissan that needed new brakes and made disturbing noises whenever he accelerated too quickly. He told himself he was just going for a drive, that he was restless and needed to move, but he knew the truth. He was looking for the sedan. He drove down Atlantic Avenue beneath the elevated tracks, past the loading zone where he had first seen it. Empty. He drove along Rochester Avenue past the brownstones where it had appeared the second time. Nothing. He covered his entire patrol route, street by street, searching for that dark Honda with the plate HNK 4739. He found it at 3:30 in the morning, parked on a residential street he had not checked yet, a quiet block of attached houses in Crown Heights. The sedan was parked legally on the street, no engine running this time, dark and silent among the other parked vehicles. Morrissey pulled over across the street and sat in his car, watching it. He was off duty, out of uniform, with no legal authority to approach the vehicle or investigate it. But he could watch, and he did, sitting in the cold car with his hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at that sedan and waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The sedan sat there as still and ordinary as every other parked car on the block. After an hour, Morrissey started his engine and drove home, feeling foolish and exhausted. He was giving meaning to random events, constructing a mystery out of coincidence. The sedan belonged to someone who lived or worked in Brooklyn and drove around the borough like thousands of other people. The fact that Morrissey had encountered it multiple times was unremarkable in a city this dense. The figure he thought he had seen was a trick of light and shadow and fatigue. There was no mystery, no message, no violation of reality. Just a car and a tired cop who needed to get his head straight. But as he lay in bed that morning, watching the daylight filter through the edges of his blackout curtains, Morrissey could not shake the memory of that figure turning to look at him in his dream, wearing his face, smiling that wrong smile. And he could not stop wondering what would happen the next time he encountered the sedan, because he knew with absolute certainty that there would be a next time. The pattern had not been broken by impounding the vehicle or taking a day off or any rational action he could take. Something had been set in motion, and it would continue until it reached whatever conclusion it was moving toward. All Morrissey could do was wait and try to maintain his grip on the distinction between what was real and what was not, a distinction that felt less solid with each passing night. Morrissey returned to duty 2 nights later with the resolve to treat the sedan encounters as closed incidents that required no further attention from him. Sergeant Quinn had called him the afternoon before his return to inform him that the impounded Honda had been thoroughly searched by the department's forensic team and had yielded nothing of interest. No contraband, no weapons, no evidence of any criminal activity whatsoever. The vehicle was clean in every sense of the word. The registered owner, Michael Voss, had been contacted and had seemed genuinely confused about why his car had been impounded. He claimed the vehicle had been parked in his garage in Forest Hills for the past 2 weeks while he recovered from minor surgery. He provided documentation from his doctor confirming the surgery date and his recovery period. He had not driven the car to Brooklyn, had not loaned it to anyone, and could not explain how it had been found in multiple locations across the borough. Quinn had told Morrissey that the case was being classified as unexplained but not criminal, possibly involving identity theft or cloned plates, though the VIN numbers had checked out as legitimate. The Honda had been released back to Voss, who had driven it home with a police escort to ensure he actually made it back to Queens. As far as the department was concerned, the matter was resolved. Whatever had been happening was over, and Morrissey should return to his regular duties without dwelling on incidents that defied easy explanation. The city was full of strange occurrences that never made sense when examined too closely, and experienced officers learned to file away such mysteries and move forward. But Morrissey could not move forward. The encounters had lodged themselves in his mind with the persistence of a recurring nightmare, and no amount of rational explanation could dislodge them. He found himself checking every dark sedan he passed during patrol, his eyes automatically scanning for the plate number HNK 4739, even though he knew the vehicle was back in Queens with its confused owner. Pike noticed the distraction and asked if everything was all right, and Morrissey assured him it was, but the lie felt transparent even as he spoke it. Nothing was all right. Something fundamental had shifted in how Morrissey experienced his work, his city, his reality. The first 3 nights back on duty passed without incident. Morrissey and Pike responded to their usual calls, drove their usual routes, and maintained the usual rhythms of night shift work. Morrissey began to relax slightly, began to believe that perhaps Quinn had been right, and the strangeness had simply ended. Whatever pattern had been developing had been interrupted by the impound and the investigation, and now life would return to normal. He almost convinced himself this was true. On the 4th night, everything changed. Morrissey and Pike were driving east on Fulton Street just after midnight when the call came through from dispatch. Calloway's voice carried an unusual tension that immediately put Morrissey on alert. All units in the 7-9, we have a report of a vehicle matching the description of a Honda Accord, plate Henry November Kilo 4739, involved in a hit and run at the corner of Nostrand and Myrtle. Vehicle fled southbound on Nostrand. No injuries reported. All units be advised, this plate was flagged in the system earlier this week for suspicious circumstances. Morrissey felt his stomach drop. He looked at Pike, who was already reaching for the radio to respond. 7-9 Adam, we're at Fulton and Bedford. We can intercept if the vehicle continues south on Nostrand. Copy, 7-9 Adam. Use caution. Vehicle may have been involved in previous unexplained incidents. Pike activated the lights and siren and accelerated toward the Nostrand Avenue. Morrissey's mind was racing. The Honda was supposed to be in Queens with Michael Voss. Either Voss had lied about not driving it, or someone else had access to the vehicle, or something impossible was happening. Morrissey found himself hoping for the first two options, even as he suspected the third was closer to the truth. They reached Nostrand Avenue and turned south, scanning the traffic ahead for any sign of the dark sedan. At this hour, the street was relatively empty, making it easy to spot vehicles matching the description. 2 blocks south of Myrtle, Morrissey saw it. The Honda was traveling at normal speed in the right lane, showing no signs of fleeing or attempting to evade police. Pike pulled up behind it and activated the patrol car's spotlight, illuminating the rear plate. HNK 4739. "That's it?" Morrissey said, his voice tight. "Same plate." Pike called in their position and requested backup before initiating the traffic stop. The Honda's brake lights came on immediately, and the vehicle pulled over to the curb in a textbook perfect stop, using the turn signal and everything. It was the kind of cooperative response that usually indicated a driver who was not expecting trouble and had no reason to fear police contact. Pike positioned the patrol car behind the Honda with their lights still flashing, and both officers exited carefully. Morrissey approached on the driver's side, while Pike covered from the passenger side, both of them following the standard high-risk stop procedure that the situation seemed to warrant given the hit-and-run report. As Morrissey drew closer, he could see through the rear window that the driver's seat was occupied. A figure sat behind the wheel, hands visible on the steering wheel in the 10 and 2 position, showing compliance with standard police instructions, even though those instructions had not yet been given. Morrissey reached the driver's window and rapped on it with his flashlight. "Police, roll down your window and show me your hands." His voice came out steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The window rolled down smoothly. Morrissey shone his flashlight into the interior and felt reality tilt sideways. The driver's seat was empty. No person sat behind the wheel, but the steering wheel was still being held in the 10 and 2 position by hands that were there, but not there, visible for a split second before they faded into nothing. The engine was running. The radio was playing quietly. Everything indicated an occupied vehicle except for the complete absence of any occupant. Pike had moved to the passenger window and was looking in with his flashlight. "Morrissey, there's nobody in here." "I can see that," Morrissey said. His hand had moved automatically to his service weapon, though what he would shoot at he could not have said. He pulled open the driver's door, half expecting the figure to reappear, but the seat remained empty. He checked the back seat, the floor, every space where a person could possibly hide. Nothing. 2 more patrol units arrived as backup, their lights painting the street in alternating red and blue. Officers exited and approached, and Morrissey had to explain the situation while knowing how insane it sounded. An empty vehicle that had been reported fleeing a hit-and-run scene. A vehicle that had pulled over and rolled down its window when stopped, despite having no driver. The same vehicle that had been impounded days earlier and released to its owner in Queens. One of the responding officers, a veteran named Kowalski who had been with the 79th for 20 years, walked around the Honda carefully, his flashlight sweeping across every surface. "This the ghost car from your reports?" he asked Morrissey. "Same plate number," Morrissey confirmed. Kowalski opened the driver's door wider and leaned in to examine the interior. After a moment, he straightened up and shook his head. "Keys are in the ignition, engines running, transmissions in drive. This vehicle is operating itself." "That's not possible," Pike said, but his voice lacked conviction. "None of this is possible," Kowalski replied. "But here we are." Sergeant Quinn arrived 15 minutes later, along with a lieutenant from the night shift command staff whom Morrissey did not recognize. They conducted their own inspection of the vehicle and interviewed all the officers on scene. Morrissey gave his statement, describing the traffic stop and the moment when the window had rolled down on an empty vehicle. The other officers corroborated his account. There was no room for interpretation or disagreement. Something impossible had occurred, and 7 police officers had witnessed it. Quinn made the decision to have the vehicle towed again, this time to the department's secure impound facility where it could be held for an extended investigation. As they waited for the tow truck, Morrissey stood next to his patrol car and watched the Honda sitting at the curb with its engine still running. Pike stood beside him, neither of them speaking. What was there to say? They had both seen what they had seen, and no amount of discussion would make it make sense. "You know what bothers me most?" Pike finally said. "The hit-and-run report. Someone called 911 and reported seeing that vehicle hit another car, which means someone saw a driver. Someone saw this car being driven by a person." Morrissey had been trying not to think about that detail. "We need to interview the witness." Quinn overheard them and walked over. "Already sent a unit to take a statement. Woman was walking her dog and saw the Honda run a red light and clip the bumper of a taxi. She said the driver was male, 30s or 40s, wearing dark clothing. She watched the Honda flee the scene and called it in. We're pulling traffic camera footage from the intersection to corroborate. The cameras will show the same thing we're seeing," Morrissey said. "An empty vehicle. Maybe they'll show something we can't see with our eyes. Either way, we need to document everything properly." Quinn paused, then looked directly at Morrissey. "I'm pulling you from the patrol for the rest of the week. You're too close to this, and I don't need you making decisions in the field while you're dealing with whatever psychological impact this situation is having." Morrissey wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. His hands were shaking slightly, a fine tremor that he could not quite control. His heart rate had not returned to normal since the traffic stop. He was experiencing symptoms of acute stress that no amount of training could fully prepare someone to handle when confronted with events that violated fundamental assumptions about reality. "Desk duty?" he asked. "No." "Real leave. Go home, see the department psychologist, get your head straight. This is not a punishment. This is me making sure you're fit for duty before I put you back out there." The tow truck arrived, and the driver hooked up the Honda for the second time in a week. As the vehicle was lifted onto the flatbed, Morrissey noticed something that made his blood run cold. Through the rear window of the Honda, now elevated above street level, he could clearly see a figure sitting in the driver's seat. The same figure he had seen every other time he had approached the vehicle from outside. It sat perfectly still, facing forward, hands on the wheel. Morrissey pointed at it, his hand shaking. "Pike, do you see that?" Pike looked up at the elevated Honda. "See what?" "The driver, in the seat. You're looking right at it." Pike stared at the vehicle for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Morrissey, there's nobody there. The car's empty." Morrissey looked at the other officers gathered on the scene. "Does anyone else see someone in that vehicle?" They all looked. They all shook their heads. Kowalski put a hand on Morrissey's shoulder. "Come on. Let Quinn drive you home. You've had enough for tonight." But Morrissey could not stop looking at the figure in the Honda as the tow truck pulled away down Nostrand Avenue. It sat there in the driver's seat, visible only to him, apparently. And as the truck turned the corner and the Honda disappeared from view, Morrissey could have sworn the figure turned its head to look directly at him one last time. And in that brief moment before it was gone, he saw its face clearly for the first time. It was his own face looking back at him, wearing an expression of patient waiting, as though it knew something he did not yet understand but soon would. Quinn drove Morrissey home in her patrol SUV, while Pike followed in their unit to give Quinn a ride back to the precinct. The drive passed in silence. Morrissey sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing streets, trying to process what was happening to him. Was he having a breakdown? Was this how it started? This slow dissolution of the boundary between reality and delusion? He had seen officers crack under the stress of the job before, watched good cops gradually lose their ability to distinguish between the horrors they witnessed daily and paranoid fantasies that grew from that trauma. Was that what was happening to him? But Pike had seen the empty vehicle too. So had Kowalski and Quinn and the other responding officers. They had all witnessed the Honda rolling down its window with no one inside to operate the controls. That part was real, verified by multiple witnesses. So if that was real, could the figure he saw also be real, even if no one else could see it? Was he experiencing something beyond the normal range of perception? Or was he simply the first to break under the weight of an impossible situation? Quinn pulled up in front of his building and turned to look at him. "I've been doing this job for 16 years, Morrissey. I've seen things that don't make sense, seen cases that never add up no matter how hard you work them. Most of the time, there's an explanation eventually, even if it takes months or years to find it. Sometimes there's not. You learn to live with that uncertainty or you find another line of work. What you don't do is let it consume you." "What if it's not uncertainty?" Morrissey asked. "What if I'm seeing something real that everyone else can't see? What does that mean?" "It means you talk to the department psychologist and figure out why that might be happening. It means you take some time away from the street until you can trust your own perceptions again. And it means you accept that sometimes the job shows you things that change how you understand the world. And that's not necessarily a sign of weakness or failure. It's just what happens when you spend enough time looking into the darkness." Morrissey nodded and exited the SUV. He stood on the sidewalk and watched as Quinn drove away, leaving him alone on the empty street. The sky was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. In a few hours, the city would wake up and fill with people going about their normal lives, unaware that impossible things happened in the hours when they slept. Morrissey climbed the stairs to his apartment and locked the door behind him, but he did not feel safe. The figure with his face was out there somewhere, sitting in that Honda, waiting for whatever came next. And Morrissey knew, with a certainty that transcended logic or evidence, that he had not seen the last of it. The pattern was not broken. It was still unfolding, still moving toward some conclusion that he could not yet perceive. All he could do was wait and try to maintain his sanity until that conclusion arrived. He did not sleep that morning. Instead, he sat by his window and watched the street below, searching every passing vehicle for a dark Honda with the plate HNK 4739, knowing it would not appear but unable to stop looking. And in the back of his mind, a question repeated itself with the persistence of a heartbeat. Why me? Why was he the one who could see the figure? What made him different from Pike and Quinn and all the other officers who had looked at that empty vehicle and seen nothing but an unexplained mechanical phenomenon? The question had no answer, at least not yet, but Morrissey suspected that when the answer finally came, it would change everything he thought he knew about himself and the city he had sworn to protect. The department psychologist's office was located on the 3rd floor of a municipal building in downtown Brooklyn, far enough from the precinct that officers could attend appointments without feeling watched by their colleagues. Dr. Sarah Brennan had been conducting fitness for duty evaluations for the NYPD for 15 years, and her office reflected a careful balance between professional authority and therapeutic comfort. Diplomas and certifications hung on one wall while the others displayed abstract art that was meant to be calming, but instead reminded Morrissey of the formless shapes he sometimes saw in the shadows during his patrol shifts. Morrissey sat in the leather chair across from Brennan's desk and tried to explain what he had experienced without sounding like he was having a psychotic break. He described the encounters with the Honda, the figure that appeared and disappeared, the traffic stop where the window had rolled down on an empty vehicle. He told her about seeing his own face looking back at him from the driver's seat, visible only to him while every other officer saw nothing. Brennan listened without interruption, taking occasional notes on her tablet, her expression neutral and professional. When Morrissey finished, Brennan set down her tablet and leaned back in her chair. "Have you experienced any other unusual perceptions? Heard voices when no one was speaking? Seen things that others around you couldn't see, besides the figure in the vehicle?" "No, nothing else, just this." "Have you been sleeping regularly, eating properly? Any changes in your substance use?" "I work night shift. Sleep is never regular. I eat when I can. I don't drink much. Never use drugs." Brennan nodded, making more notes. Night shift work creates significant disruption to circadian rhythms, which can produce symptoms that mimic various psychological conditions. Sleep deprivation, even chronic low-level deprivation, can cause visual hallucinations, paranoid thinking, difficulty distinguishing between dreams and waking reality. What you're describing could be explained entirely by fatigue and the stress of repeatedly encountering an anomalous situation that your mind is trying to process. Other officers saw the vehicle operating itself, Morrissey said. That part isn't a hallucination. No, but your interpretation of it might be shaped by fatigue and stress. The vehicle was likely being operated by remote control. Or there's a mechanical explanation we haven't discovered yet. Your mind, already primed by the previous strange encounters, constructed a narrative involving a figure that appeared and disappeared. The fact that you began seeing your own face suggests a projection of anxiety about your own mental state onto the situation. It's actually a fairly common response to acute stress in law enforcement contexts. Morrissey wanted to believe her. The explanation was rational, grounded in established psychology, and offered a path back to normal functioning. All he had to do was accept that he had been mistaken, that fatigue and stress had caused him to see things that were not there, that the mystery of the Honda was simply an unsolved mechanical puzzle that would eventually yield a mundane explanation. He tried to make himself believe it, but something fundamental in him resisted. What he had seen felt more real than anything he had experienced in years of police work. The figure with his face had looked at him with recognition, with intention. That was not a hallucination born of exhaustion. That was something else entirely. "I want to return to duty," Morrissey said. "I need to work. I'm going to recommend a minimum of 2 weeks leave before you're cleared for patrol. During that time, I want you to work on establishing better sleep hygiene, maintaining regular meal schedules, and avoiding any behavior that might be reinforcing the paranoid thinking patterns. That means no driving around Brooklyn at night looking for this vehicle. No obsessive reviewing of the case files. You need to give your mind space to recover from the accumulated stress." Morrissey left the session with a prescription for sleep medication and a follow-up appointment scheduled for 1 week later. He walked out of the municipal building into the afternoon sunlight feeling disconnected from the normal world around him. People passed by on the sidewalk, going about their daily business, living in a reality where cars did not drive themselves and figures did not appear and disappear in driver's seats. Morrissey envied them their certainty, their ability to move through the world without questioning the fundamental reliability of their own perceptions. He took the subway back to Sunset Park and spent the rest of the day in his apartment, trying to follow Brennan's advice about rest and routine. He ate a proper meal, took the sleep medication at the prescribed time, and lay down in his bed with the blackout curtains closed. The medication worked quickly, pulling him down into a heavy dreamless sleep that lasted 12 hours. When he woke, it was 3 in the morning, and his body's internal clock insisted it was time to be at work, time to be on patrol, time to be watching the streets. Morrissey sat on the edge of his bed in the darkness and felt the pull of the night shift like a physical force. He was not supposed to be working. He was on mandated leave, under psychological evaluation, explicitly instructed not to engage with anything related to the Honda case. But the knowledge that the vehicle was out there somewhere, that the figure with his face was sitting in that driver's seat waiting for something, was impossible to ignore. After 30 minutes of trying to convince himself to go back to sleep, Morrissey got dressed and left his apartment. He drove his personal vehicle into Brooklyn, following the patrol routes he knew by memory, scanning every street and parking lot for the dark Honda. The city at night was as familiar to him as his own apartment. More familiar, perhaps, since he spent more waking hours on these streets than he did in any other location. He knew which businesses closed at what times, which corners attracted drug activity, which blocks were controlled by which crews. This knowledge was encoded in his muscles and reflexes after 8 years of night shift work, and being away from it felt like being separated from a part of himself. He found the Honda at 4:30 in the morning, parked on a side street in Bed-Stuy, engine running, lights off. Morrissey pulled over a block away and watched it from a distance. He could see the figure in the driver's seat, clear and solid in his vision even from this far away. It sat perfectly still, hands on the wheel, facing forward. Morrissey knew that if he approached the vehicle and looked inside, he would see his own face looking back at him. He knew that if he opened the door, the seat would be empty. The pattern had established itself through repetition, and Morrissey understood that he was trapped in a loop that would continue until something changed or broke. He sat in his car watching the Honda for over an hour. No other vehicles passed on the quiet residential street. No pedestrians emerged from the nearby buildings. It was just Morrissey and the Honda, and the figure that only he could see, suspended in a moment that felt outside of normal time. Finally, Morrissey started his engine and drove closer. Pulling up directly behind the Honda, as he had done multiple times before in his patrol car. He exited his vehicle and approached the driver's side window. The figure sat there wearing his face, and this time it turned to look at him as he approached. The movement was slow and deliberate, and the eyes that met his were his own eyes, but they held an expression he had never seen in his own reflection. Recognition, yes, but something else too. Satisfaction, perhaps, or completion, as though something that had been waiting a long time had finally occurred. Morrissey reached for the door handle, and the figure inside shook its head slowly. A clear gesture. No. Do not open the door. Morrissey's hand froze on the handle. He stood there on the empty street, looking at his own face through the window of an impossible vehicle, and felt reality shift around him in a way that was both terrifying and strangely liberating. If this was madness, then madness had its own logic and rules. If this was something else, something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal experience, then perhaps he had been chosen or cursed, or marked to perceive it for reasons he could not yet understand. "What do you want?" Morrissey asked, his voice loud in the pre-dawn silence. The figure pointed forward through the windshield, down the street toward the intersection ahead. Morrissey looked in that direction and saw nothing unusual. Just empty street, dark buildings, the familiar geography of his patrol sector. When he looked back at the figure, it was pointing more insistently, and its expression had changed to something urgent, almost pleading. Morrissey returned to his vehicle and drove forward slowly, following the direction the figure had indicated. The Honda's engine revved and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, moving down the street ahead of him. Morrissey followed, understanding on some instinctive level that this was what had been building toward all along. The multiple encounters, the escalating strangeness, his unique ability to see the figure when others could not. All of it had been leading to this moment, this drive through the empty Brooklyn streets following a vehicle driven by something wearing his face. The Honda led him on a winding route through Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, turning seemingly at random, but Morrissey recognized the underlying pattern. They were following his usual patrol route, the path he drove 5 nights a week, covering the same streets in the same sequence he had driven them thousands of times. But now he was seeing them from a different perspective, following instead of leading, passenger to a mystery instead of investigator trying to solve it. The sky was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. When the Honda finally stopped, they were on Atlantic Avenue beneath the elevated train tracks, in the same loading zone where Morrissey had first encountered the vehicle 2 weeks earlier. The Honda pulled to the curb, and the engine shut off. Morrissey stopped his vehicle behind it and sat waiting for whatever came next. The figure in the driver's seat turned to look at him one last time, and Morrissey saw something in that gaze that made his chest tighten with a feeling he could not name. Not fear exactly, but a profound sense of recognition, of seeing something essential about himself reflected back through the impossible barrier of this encounter. Then the figure raised one hand in a gesture that might have been farewell, or acknowledgement or warning, and faded from view. Not disappearing suddenly, but gradually becoming transparent, less solid, until there was nothing in the driver's seat but empty space. Morrissey sat in his car for a long time, watching the Honda as dawn broke fully over the city and the street began to wake up around him. Delivery trucks passed by. Early morning commuters emerged from apartment buildings. The normal world reasserted itself, indifferent to the impossible thing that had just occurred. Eventually, Morrissey started his engine and drove home, his mind curiously empty of thoughts, as though the experience had temporarily short-circuited his ability to process or analyze what had happened. He did not return to Dr. Brennan's office for his follow-up appointment. He did not call the precinct to check on the status of the Honda investigation. He spent his mandated 2 weeks of leave in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normal life while feeling increasingly disconnected from it. He slept at odd hours, ate irregularly, and spent long periods sitting by his window staring at the street below without really seeing it. The sleep medication sat unused in his bathroom cabinet. He did not need it anymore. Sleep came easily now, deep and dreamless, as though something that had been keeping him alert and anxious had finally released its hold. When the 2 weeks ended, Morrissey reported back to the precinct for his return to duty evaluation. Sergeant Quinn interviewed him in her office, asking questions about his sleep, his stress levels, his readiness to resume patrol work. Morrissey answered with the responses he knew were expected, and Quinn seemed satisfied. She told him he would be back on the roster starting that night, partnered again with Pike, resuming his regular schedule. Everything would return to normal. But that night, when Morrissey climbed into the patrol car and Pike started the engine, and they pulled out onto the streets to begin their shift, Morrissey knew that nothing would ever be normal again. Not because of what he had seen, though that was part of it, but because of what the experience had revealed about the nature of the reality he moved through every night. The city was not what it appeared to be. The streets held depths and dimensions that most people never perceived, and once you had seen past the surface, you could not unsee it. They drove their patrol route, responding to calls, conducting traffic stops, performing the routine functions of police work. But now Morrissey found himself looking at everything differently, wondering what else might be operating just beyond the edge of normal perception. Every dark sedan made him pause, checking the plate number automatically even though he knew the Honda was gone, dissolved back into whatever impossible space it had emerged from. Every shadow held the potential for something more than absence of light. Every empty street raised the question of whether it was truly empty or simply empty to his limited senses. Pike noticed the change, but did not comment on it directly. He made small talk about mundane things, filling the silence that Morrissey no longer felt compelled to fill. They worked their shift and returned to the precinct, and Morrissey filed his reports and went home. And the pattern repeated itself night after night, week after week. On the surface, everything was normal. Morrissey was functioning, performing his duties, maintaining his fitness for the work. But underneath, something fundamental had altered. 3 months after the final encounter with the Honda, Morrissey was driving alone on Atlantic Avenue during a solo patrol when he saw it again. The dark sedan parked in the loading zone beneath the elevated tracks, engine running, lights off. He pulled up behind it with his heart hammering in his chest, uncertain whether he was experiencing a resurgence of the phenomenon, or simply witnessing a coincidental vehicle that matched the description. He called in the plate number and waited for Calloway's response. 79 Adam. That plate returns to a 2014 Honda Accord, registered owner in Forest Hills. Same vehicle from your previous reports. You want me to dispatch backup? Negative, Central. I'm just going to check on the status. Morrissey approached the vehicle slowly, preparing himself to see the figure in the driver's seat, preparing for his own face to look back at him through the window. But when he reached the driver's side and looked in, the seat was empty. Genuinely empty, with no figure visible at any angle. He tried the door handle and found it locked. He shone his flashlight through the window and saw nothing unusual, just an empty vehicle with the engine running and the keys in the ignition. He stood there on the street, feeling something that might have been disappointment or relief, or a combination of both. The pattern had been broken. The phenomenon had ended. Whatever message or warning or transformation the encounters had been meant to convey had been delivered. And now there was nothing left but ordinary reality and the ordinary work of policing it. Morrissey should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt a profound sense of loss, as though something essential had been taken from him. He called for a tow truck and waited for it to arrive, documenting the abandoned vehicle according to standard procedure. When the truck lifted the Honda onto its flatbed and drove away, Morrissey watched it disappear down Atlantic Avenue and knew he was watching more than just a car being towed. He was watching the last connection to an experience that had changed him in ways he still did not fully understand, severed and removed, leaving him alone with his memories and his questions, and the absolute certainty that what he had experienced was real, regardless of whether anyone else believed it. Pike picked him up 20 minutes later after completing a call on the other side of the sector. "Was that the ghost car again?" he asked, as Morrissey climbed into the passenger seat. "Just an abandoned vehicle," Morrissey said. "Nothing unusual." Pike looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to push for more information, then shrugged and put the patrol car in gear. They drove in silence through the streets, following their route, and Morrissey looked out the window at the city passing by and wondered if the figure with his face was still out there somewhere, waiting in some space between reality and impossibility, or if it had accomplished whatever purpose it served and moved on to someone else, some other officer working some other night shift in some other city, ready to begin the pattern again. He would never know the answer. The Honda would be returned to Michael Voss once more, who would again express confusion about how his vehicle kept appearing in Brooklyn. The case would be filed away as unsolved and unexplained, one of hundreds of minor mysteries that accumulated in police databases without ever reaching resolution. And Morrissey would continue to work his night shifts, driving the same streets, responding to the same types of calls, performing the work he had done for 8 years and would do for however many more years remained until retirement. But he would do it differently now, with an awareness that the boundaries of reality were more permeable than he had previously believed. And sometimes, late at night when he was alone on patrol and the streets were empty and the city held its breath in the hours before dawn, he would find himself looking for dark sedans with the plate HNK 4739, hoping and fearing in equal measure that he might see it one more time, might have one more chance to understand what it had been trying to tell him. The answer never came. The Honda never appeared again, and Morrissey continued his work in the darkness, watching and waiting, forever changed by an encounter that no report could adequately document and no explanation could adequately address. Officer Hollis Carver had been working patrol in Queens for 6 years, and in that time he had developed a particular expertise in responding to industrial sector calls. The manufacturing district along the Newtown Creek waterfront was a sprawl of warehouses, factories, and distribution centers that operated around the clock, creating a constant flow of incidents that required police attention. Theft from loading docks, disputes between delivery drivers and receiving clerks, workers injured on the job who needed emergency response, the occasional break-in at facilities that had been closed for the night. Carver knew the area better than most officers in his precinct, had developed relationships with the security personnel who worked these buildings, and understood the particular rhythms and patterns of criminal activity that emerged in spaces dedicated to manufacturing and storage rather than residential life. The call came through dispatch at 11:47 on a Wednesday night in late October. A security guard at the old Kellner manufacturing building had activated a panic button, triggering an automatic alert to the NYPD. The building had been mostly vacant for 3 years, ever since Kellner had relocated their operations to New Jersey, but the property management company maintained minimal security presence to prevent vandalism and squatting while they tried to find new tenants or a buyer for the massive structure. Carver was only 4 blocks away when the call came through, finishing up paperwork on a minor traffic accident that had blocked one of the loading zones on 43rd Avenue. He acknowledged the call and drove toward the Kellner building, a 4-story brick structure that occupied an entire block between the creek and the elevated train tracks. The building had been constructed in the 1950s during the height of Queens' manufacturing boom, and its architecture reflected that era's utilitarian aesthetic. No windows on the first floor for security reasons. Small industrial windows on the upper floors, loading docks on 3 sides, and a single main entrance that faced the street. The building looked abandoned, even though technically it was not, its dark bulk rising against the night sky like a monument to an economic era that had ended decades ago. Carver pulled into the empty parking lot and immediately noticed that something felt wrong. The security guard's vehicle was parked near the main entrance, an older sedan with a magnetic sign on the door indicating it belonged to Secure Watch Services, the company contracted to provide overnight monitoring. But the building itself was completely dark. No lights visible in any of the windows, no illumination from the entrance, nothing. Security guards working alone in vacant buildings typically kept at least some interior lights on, both for their own comfort and to deter potential intruders who might assume the building was completely unoccupied. Carver radioed dispatch to confirm he was on scene and requested the security guard's information. The dispatcher came back within seconds with the details. Guard's name was Doyle Fenwick, 48 years old, had been working for Secure Watch for 2 years, no criminal history, no previous incidents. The panic button had been activated at 11:43, just 4 minutes before Carver arrived. Fenwick had not responded to attempts by the security company's central office to reach him by radio or phone. Carver exited his patrol car and approached the main entrance, his flashlight in one hand and his other hand resting on his service weapon. The entrance doors were heavy steel with reinforced glass panels, and they were locked. Carver could see into the lobby through the glass, a small reception area with a security desk and a bank of elevator doors beyond. The security desk had a single lamp turned on, casting a pool of yellow light in the otherwise dark space. Carver could see movement behind the desk, a figure sitting in the security guard's chair. He knocked on the glass door, the sound echoing loudly in the empty parking lot. The figure at the desk did not respond. Carver knocked again, harder this time, and called out that he was police responding to an emergency call. Still no response. The figure remained motionless, hunched over the desk as though working on something or perhaps asleep. Carver pulled out his phone and called the security company's central office, identifying himself and requesting that they unlock the entrance remotely or provide him with an access code. The operator on the other end sounded nervous and explained that the building's electronic locks had malfunctioned earlier that evening, which was why Fenwick had been dispatched to conduct a physical inspection rather than simply monitoring from the central office. "Can you see him?" the operator asked. "We've been trying to raise him for the past 5 minutes, but he's not responding to radio or phone." "I can see someone at the security desk, but they're not responding to me either. I need access to this building immediately." The operator gave Carver a backup entry code that worked on a keypad system independent of the electronic locks. Carver found the keypad on the wall beside the entrance, entered the code, and heard the mechanical click of the lock disengaging. He pushed open the heavy door and entered the lobby, his flashlight sweeping across the space as he moved toward the security desk. "Doyle Fenwick. This is NYPD. I'm responding to your emergency call. Are you all right?" The figure at the desk still did not move or respond. As Carver got closer, he could see more details. It was definitely a person, wearing the dark uniform of a security guard, sitting in the chair with their head down as though examining something on the desk surface. Carver moved around to the front of the desk and shone his flashlight directly at the figure. It was Fenwick. Carver could see the name badge clipped to his uniform shirt. But something was wrong with the way he was sitting. His posture too rigid, his head held at an angle that looked uncomfortable. Carver reached out and touched Fenwick's shoulder, and the man jerked upright suddenly, gasping as though he had been holding his breath. His eyes were wide and unfocused, his face pale and covered in a sheen of sweat. "Jesus Christ," Fenwick said, his voice hoarse. "Jesus Christ, thank God you're here. What happened? Why did you activate your panic button?" Fenwick stared at Carver for a long moment as though having difficulty processing the question. His hands were shaking visibly, and when he tried to stand up, his legs seemed unsteady. Carver helped him sit back down and pulled over a visitor chair for himself. "I saw someone," Fenwick finally said. "In the building, on the cameras. I saw someone moving through the 3rd floor." Carver looked at the security desk, which held an older model computer monitor displaying a grid of camera feeds from throughout the building. The feeds showed various interior spaces, all dark and empty. Hallways, storage rooms, what looked like former manufacturing floors with old equipment still in place. "Did you go check it out?" No, I didn't. I called it into central office first, like protocol says. They told me to wait for police before investigating. But while I was waiting, I kept watching the cameras, and I saw... Fenwick trailed off, his expression suggesting he was reluctant to continue. "Saw what?" "I saw you, on the cameras. I saw you walking through the building, but you weren't here yet. You were still on your way. I could see you on multiple cameras moving through the 3rd floor, checking rooms, but you were also outside in your patrol car pulling into the parking lot. I was seeing you in 2 places at the same time." Carver felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He looked at the monitor displaying the camera feeds, scanning each small window of video for any movement or anomaly. Everything appeared still and empty, exactly as one would expect in a vacant building at night. "Show me," Carver said. Fenwick manipulated the computer controls, pulling up recorded footage from earlier in the evening. He fast-forwarded through long stretches of nothing, then slowed down and pointed at one of the feeds showing a third-floor hallway. "There. Watch that one." Carver leaned closer to the monitor. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by emergency exit lights at either end. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, walking slowly toward the camera. The figure was wearing what appeared to be a police uniform, and as it got closer to the camera, Carver could see the face clearly. It was his own face. The figure on the camera was him, walking through a building he had not yet entered, captured on video at a time when he had been 4 blocks away finishing his accident report. "That's impossible," Carver said. But even as he spoke, he was watching his own image move through the hallway on the recording, watching himself check doors and shine a flashlight into rooms, performing exactly the kind of security sweep he would have done if he had actually been there. The timestamp on the footage showed 11:37, 10 minutes before Fenwick had activated his panic button, 15 minutes before Carver had actually entered the building. "There's more," Fenwick said, his voice shaking. "It's not just that one hallway. He showed up on multiple cameras. 3rd floor, 2nd floor, even down in the basement. Always doing the same thing, checking rooms like he was searching for something. And the more I watched, the more I realized that whoever or whatever that is, it was following the exact route through the building that I would have taken if I had gone to investigate myself. It knew where I would go, what I would check, like it was showing me what would happen before it happened." Carver watched several more minutes of recorded footage, seeing himself appear and disappear across different camera feeds, moving through the empty building in a pattern that did follow standard security sweep procedures. Every time the figure passed under decent lighting, Carver could see his own face clearly. Not similar, not someone who resembled him, but unmistakably him. Same features, same build, same way of moving. It was like watching a recording of himself performing duties he had not yet performed in a building he had not yet entered. "Did you see anyone else? Any other figures besides this one?" "Just you. Just that one. But, officer, that's not even the worst part." Fenwick pulled up the live camera feeds again, the real-time view of the building's interior. "Look at the 3rd floor, camera 7. Carver looked at the feed Fenwick indicated. It showed the same hallway from the recorded footage, empty and dark. As Carver watched, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. The same figure, Carver in his uniform, walking slowly toward the camera, checking doors, shining a flashlight. The movement was identical to what had been recorded earlier, playing out again in real time, even though Carver was sitting in the lobby looking at a monitor. "That's happening right now," Fenwick whispered. "Right now, while you're sitting here next to me, that thing is walking through the 3rd floor wearing your face. And when you go up there to check it out, I guarantee you won't find anything, because I don't think it's really there. I think the cameras are seeing something that exists in some other time or dimension or I don't know what. But it's not natural. It's not right." Carver stood up from his chair, his hand automatically moving to his service weapon. Every instinct developed through 6 years of police work told him that this situation was dangerous in ways he did not yet understand. He radioed dispatch and requested backup, explaining that he was investigating a possible intruder in the building and needed additional units to conduct a thorough search. Dispatch confirmed that backup was en route, estimated arrival time 6 minutes. "I need to go up there," Carver said. "I need to verify what's on those cameras." "Don't," Fenwick said urgently. "Please don't go up there alone. Wait for backup. Whatever that thing is, I don't think you want to confront it by yourself." but Carver was already moving toward the stairwell door at the rear of the lobby. He had to know, had to see for himself, whether the figure on the cameras was real or some kind of technical glitch or elaborate hoax. He pushed open the stairwell door and began climbing toward the third floor, his flashlight illuminating the concrete steps ahead of him. The stairwell was cold and smelled of dust and old industrial chemicals, remnants of whatever manufacturing processes had been conducted here decades ago. His footsteps echoed in the enclosed space, and Carver found himself walking more quietly, trying to minimize the noise even though he was not sure why. If there was someone up there, they already knew he was coming. And if there was not, if the figure on the cameras was some kind of anomaly or technical error, then stealth was irrelevant. He reached the third-floor landing and paused with his hand on the door handle. On the other side of this door was the hallway he had seen on the camera feed, and somewhere in that hallway was a figure that wore his face and moved like him and seemed to know where he would go before he went there. Carver took a breath and pushed open the door. The hallway was exactly as it had appeared on camera, long and narrow, lined with doors that presumably led to former offices or storage rooms. Emergency exit lights provided minimal illumination, creating pools of dim red light at intervals while leaving most of the hallway in shadow. Carver stepped into the corridor and let the stairwell door close behind him. The silence was absolute, broken only by his own breathing and the faint hum of electrical systems somewhere in the building's infrastructure. He moved forward slowly, checking each door as he passed, performing the security sweep that the figure on the camera had been performing. Each door was locked. The rooms beyond were dark and appeared empty based on what Carver could see through the small windows set into the doors. He continued down the hallway, covering the same ground the figure had covered, and found nothing. No person, no evidence that anyone had been here recently, no indication that the building contained anything but emptiness and silence. Carver reached the end of the hallway where the figure on camera had disappeared from view. There was another stairwell door here, and a service corridor that branched off to the left. Carver checked both, finding more of the same. Empty spaces, locked doors, darkness and quiet. He returned to the main hallway and stood in the spot where the figure had been most clearly visible on the camera feed. If Fenwick was watching the live feed right now, he would see Carver standing in exactly the same position that the other figure had occupied. The thought made Carver's skin crawl. He pulled out his radio and contacted Fenwick. "I'm on the third floor. The hallway you showed me on camera. There's nobody here, nothing unusual." There was a pause before Fenwick responded, and when his voice came through the radio, it carried a note of barely controlled panic. "Officer Carver, you need to look at the cameras. You need to see what I'm seeing right now." "What are you seeing?" "I'm seeing both of you. You're standing in the hallway, and I can see you clear as day. But there's also another you, standing right next to you, so close you could touch it. It's looking at you. It's reaching toward you. Officer Carver, it's right there with you in that hallway." Carver spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the empty corridor. There was nothing there. He was alone in the hallway, completely alone, with no other person or figure or presence anywhere in sight. But according to Fenwick, according to what the cameras were seeing, there was something standing right next to him, close enough to touch, reaching toward him with Carver's own hand. Carver stood frozen in the third-floor hallway, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness while his mind tried to process what Fenwick had just told him. According to the security cameras, there was another version of him standing inches away, reaching toward him, but his eyes saw nothing except empty corridor. The contradiction between what the cameras recorded and what he could physically perceive created a cognitive dissonance so profound that for a moment Carver felt completely unmoored from reality. He swept his flashlight in a full circle, illuminating every angle of the hallway, and found nothing. He was alone, completely, verifiably alone. "Fenwick, I don't see anything. There's nothing here with me." The radio crackled with static before Fenwick's voice came through, tight with fear. "It's touching your shoulder now. Its hand is on your shoulder. Officer Carver, you need to get out of that hallway. You need to come back down here right now." Carver looked at his shoulder, half expecting to see a hand there despite knowing he would see nothing. His uniform was undisturbed. He felt no touch, no pressure, no indication that anything was making physical contact with him. But the certainty in Fenwick's voice was impossible to ignore. The security guard was watching something happen on those cameras, something that Carver could not perceive from his position inside the experience. The thought terrified him in a way that facing armed suspects or violent situations never had. This was a different kind of danger, one that operated outside the rules he had been trained to navigate. He heard footsteps on the stairwell, multiple sets, moving quickly upward. The backup units had arrived faster than expected, and Carver felt a surge of relief at knowing he was no longer alone in the building. The stairwell door burst open and 2 officers entered the hallway, their flashlights sweeping the space. Carver recognized them both. Officers Martinez and Kowalski from his precinct, both experienced patrol officers who had responded to industrial sector calls countless times. "Carver, you all right?" Martinez called out, approaching with his hand resting on his weapon. "Dispatch said you had a possible intruder." The security guard saw something on the cameras, someone moving through the building, but I've cleared this floor and found nothing. Kowalski was already checking doors, verifying what Carver had reported. "Building's supposed to be vacant, right? Just the one security guard?" "That's correct. But there's something you need to see on the camera feeds, something that doesn't make sense." They returned to the lobby together, Carver leading them down the stairwell while his mind continued trying to rationalize what Fenwick claimed to have seen. Technical malfunction seemed the most likely explanation. Security camera systems in old buildings were notoriously unreliable, subject to all kinds of glitches and false images, video artifacts, feedback loops, time delay errors in the recording software. Any of these could produce images that appeared anomalous but had perfectly mundane explanations. Carver clung to this reasoning as they descended, needing it to be true even as part of him suspected it was not. Fenwick was still at the security desk when they entered the lobby, but he had moved the visitor chair around so he could keep his back to the wall while watching both the entrance and the camera monitors simultaneously. His face was pale, and his hands were still shaking. Martinez and Kowalski exchanged a look that suggested they thought the security guard was overreacting to something explainable, but they approached the desk professionally and waited for Fenwick to show them what he had seen. "It's still happening," Fenwick said, pointing at one of the camera feeds. "Look at camera 7, 3rd floor hallway. That's where you just were, Officer Carver." They all looked at the indicated feed. The hallway appeared empty in the real-time video, exactly as Carver had found it during his search. Nothing moved in the frame. No figures, no anomalies, nothing that would suggest anything unusual was occurring. "I don't see anything," Martinez said. "Wait," Fenwick said. "Just watch. It comes and goes. Sometimes it's visible, sometimes it's not. But when it appears, you'll see it clearly." They watched the feed in silence for nearly a minute. The hallway remained empty and still. Carver was beginning to think that whatever Fenwick had seen had been a temporary glitch that had resolved itself when movement appeared in the frame. A figure walked into view from the left side of the screen, moving slowly down the hallway in the same methodical pattern that Carver had used during his sweep. The figure was wearing a police uniform, and when it turned slightly toward the camera, its face was clearly visible. It was Carver. Same features, same build, same way of moving. An exact duplicate captured on video, walking through a hallway that all 4 men in the lobby knew was currently empty. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski said, leaning closer to the monitor. "That's you, Carver. That's exactly you." Martinez pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, we need a supervisor to respond to the Kellner Manufacturing Building. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." While Martinez coordinated with dispatch, Carver continued watching the monitor. The figure that wore his face moved through the hallway, checking doors, shining a flashlight into rooms. Its movements were so precise, so identical to how Carver himself moved, that watching it felt like watching a recording of his own actions played back. But this was not a recording, this was happening in real time, captured by a camera that was showing something that physically was not there. "Can you pull up the other camera angles?" Carver asked Fenwick. "Show me everywhere this thing has appeared." Fenwick worked the controls, bringing up different feeds in sequence. The figure appeared on multiple cameras throughout the building, always in motion, always searching. 3rd floor, 2nd floor, basement level. It moved through the structure with purpose, as though following a specific route or looking for something particular. And on every camera, where it appeared clearly enough to make out details, the face was unmistakably Carver's face. Kowalski had pulled out his phone and was recording the monitor display, documenting what they were seeing. "This is going to sound crazy, but could this be some kind of prank? Someone wearing a mask or makeup to look like you? Maybe someone from another precinct who resembles you." "Look at the uniform details," Carver said, pointing at the screen. "Badge number, radio position, even the way my duty belt is configured. That's not someone who resembles me. That's exactly me down to the smallest detail. No one could fake that level of accuracy." Sergeant Maura Quinn arrived 20 minutes later, accompanied by a lieutenant from the precinct's detective squad, whose name Carver did not immediately recall. They conducted their own inspection of the camera feeds while the patrol officers provided their accounts of what they had witnessed. Quinn's expression remained neutral and professional throughout, but Carver could see the concern in her eyes when she watched the figure moving through the building on camera. "Show me the live feed and the recorded footage side by side," Quinn said to Fenwick. "I want to see if there's any pattern to when this appears." Fenwick pulled up both displays, splitting the screen so they could watch real-time video alongside the earlier recordings. The differences were immediately apparent. In the recorded footage from before Carver's arrival, the figure appeared frequently and remained visible for extended periods, sometimes for minutes at a time. In the current live feeds, the figure appeared only briefly, flickering in and out of visibility, showing up for a few seconds before vanishing again. It was as though whatever was causing the phenomenon was becoming less stable or less able to maintain a consistent presence. "Has anyone checked the camera system itself?" the lieutenant asked. "Verified that the equipment is functioning properly?" "I can tell you the system is old," Fenwick said. "The building owner has been putting off upgrades for years, but I've been working here 2 nights a week for 6 months, and I've never seen anything like this. No glitches, no video artifacts, nothing unusual until tonight." Quinn made the decision to bring in a technical specialist to examine the security camera system, someone who could determine whether the images were being produced by equipment malfunction or software errors. She also ordered a complete search of the building by multiple units, room by room, floor by floor, to verify that no one was actually present inside the structure. If there was a rational explanation involving an intruder who was somehow avoiding detection, they would find it through systematic procedure. Over the next 2 hours, the Kellner Manufacturing Building was subjected to the most thorough search Carver had participated in during his career. 8 officers swept through every accessible space, checking storage rooms and offices, examining the old manufacturing floors with their abandoned equipment still bolted to concrete floors, investigating the basement level where heating systems and electrical infrastructure created a maze of utility corridors. They found no one, no evidence of recent human presence, no signs that anyone had been in the building besides Fenwick, who had entered through the main door and had not left the lobby area until the panic button activation. The building was empty, completely, verifiably empty. Yet the figure continued to appear on the security cameras, sometimes on the third floor, sometimes in the basement, once in a stairwell where it stood motionless for almost a full minute before fading from view. Each appearance was documented by multiple officers who watched the feeds in real time, confirming that what they were seeing was not the result of individual hallucination or misperception. The cameras were capturing something, and that something consistently resembled Officer Hollis Carver. The technical specialist arrived at 3 in the morning, a civilian contractor named Raymond who worked with the city on security system installations and repairs. He spent an hour examining the camera equipment, checking connections, reviewing system logs, and running diagnostics on the recording software. His conclusion was frustrating in its ambiguity. The equipment was old and not particularly reliable, prone to occasional glitches and image artifacts, but the images they were seeing did not match any standard malfunction pattern. They were too clear, too consistent, too detailed to be explained by technical failure alone. Raymond suggested that someone might have hacked the system and was feeding false video into the cameras, but he could find no evidence of unauthorized access or network intrusion. Honestly, Raymond said, closing his diagnostic laptop with a bewildered expression, I can't explain what's causing this. The system is functioning within normal parameters. There's no evidence of tampering or hacking. If I didn't know better, I'd say the cameras are simply recording what they're seeing. But obviously, that's impossible if no one is actually in the building. Quinn pulled Carver aside while the technical specialist was packing up his equipment. I'm sending you home for the rest of the shift. You're too close to this situation, and I need you to have some distance before we figure out what's happening here. I'm fine to work, Carver protested, though he was not sure that was true. The past few hours had left him feeling disoriented and exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. That's not a request. You're done for tonight. Martinez and Kowalski can finish out the shift. I want you to go home, get some rest, and come in tomorrow afternoon to give a formal statement. We're documenting everything about this incident for the case file. Carver wanted to argue, but he recognized the futility of it. Quinn was right. He was too emotionally involved in the situation to maintain the professional distance required for effective police work. He collected his equipment and left the Kellner building as dawn was beginning to break over Queens. The drive home through the early morning traffic felt surreal, as though he was moving through a city that was familiar but somehow fundamentally different from the one he had known before tonight. He lived in a second-floor apartment in Astoria, a neighborhood that had gentrified significantly over the past decade, but still retained traces of its working-class immigrant roots. His apartment was small and sparsely furnished, the living space of someone who spent more time working than at home. Carver had never bothered to make it comfortable or personalized. It was simply a place to sleep between shifts, nothing more. But now, entering the quiet apartment after the strangeness of the Kellner building, he felt a desperate need for the reassurance of familiar surroundings. He tried to sleep, but found it impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure on the security monitor, wearing his face, moving through empty hallways. He thought about Fenwick's description of the figure reaching toward him, touching his shoulder, while he had felt nothing. The idea that something could be interacting with him, making contact, without his ability to perceive it, created a paranoia that was difficult to shake. How could he trust his own senses if they were lying to him about something so fundamental as whether another entity was present in his immediate space? Around noon, unable to sleep and unwilling to continue lying in bed dwelling on unanswerable questions, Carver got up and drove back to the precinct. He was not scheduled to come in for several more hours, but sitting in his apartment alone with his thoughts felt worse than facing whatever awaited him at work. He found Quinn in her office reviewing incident reports on her computer. "You're early," she said, glancing up as Carver knocked on her open door. "I told you to come in this afternoon." "I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about what happened at the Kellner building. Has there been any update?" Quinn gestured for him to sit down and closed her office door for privacy. The technical specialist submitted his report, inconclusive, as expected. The detective squad is treating it as an unexplained incident, but not necessarily criminal activity. No evidence of breaking and entering, no property damage, no theft. Just a lot of strange video footage that no one can adequately explain. "What about the security guard, Fenwick? How's he handling this?" Secure Watch pulled him from the Kellner assignment. He told his supervisor he won't go back to that building under any circumstances. Can't say I blame him. The company is assigning someone else to cover the site until they decide whether to continue the contract. Carver felt a surge of guilt at the thought of another security guard being sent to work alone in that building, watching those cameras, potentially seeing the same things Fenwick had seen. That's not safe. No one should be working that site alone until we understand what's happening. I agree, and I've communicated that to Secure Watch management. But ultimately, it's their decision how to staff their contracts. Our responsibility is to investigate criminal activity, and so far there's no evidence that any crime has been committed. What I saw on those cameras wasn't normal, wasn't natural. There's something wrong with that building. Quinn leaned back in her chair and studied Carver with an expression that was both concerned and evaluating. "I've read your preliminary statement. You, Martinez, and Kowalski all corroborate the same observations. Multiple officers witnessed anomalous images on security monitors. That's documented fact. But Officer Carver, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe what you saw was real? Not the video feeds, but the underlying reality. Do you think there was actually something in that building with you?" Carver considered the question carefully before answering. What he believed was complicated. He had seen the images on the monitors with his own eyes, had watched himself moving through empty hallways in real time. But he had also physically searched those same hallways and found nothing. The evidence contradicted itself, leaving no coherent narrative that made sense. "I believe the cameras recorded something," Carver finally said. "Whether that something was actually present in physical space or exists in some other form that cameras can detect but human perception cannot, I don't know, but I don't think this is over. Whatever is happening at the Kellner building, I don't think it's finished." Quinn's expression suggested she agreed with this assessment but was reluctant to say so directly. "I want you to take tomorrow night off. Full day of leave. Give yourself time to process this experience before you return to regular patrol duties. That's an order, not a suggestion." Carver accepted the order without argument. He spent the rest of that afternoon at the precinct, giving his formal statement to the detective handling the case file and reviewing the video footage that had been copied from the Kellner building's security system. Watching the recordings on a precinct computer in the afternoon daylight should have made them less disturbing, but the opposite was true. Removed from the context of the dark building and the real-time immediacy of the experience, the images became more clearly impossible, more obviously violations of natural law. That was him on the screen, moving through spaces he had never physically occupied. Not someone who looked like him, but him. And no amount of technical analysis or rational skepticism could change that fundamental fact. He drove home as the sun was setting, the city transitioning from day to night, and felt a growing dread about what might happen after dark. The figure on the cameras had appeared during overnight hours, had manifested in that building when the city was asleep and the streets were empty. Carver found himself wondering whether it would appear again tonight, whether some new security guard would watch their monitors and see that same impossible figure walking through abandoned hallways. And he wondered, with a fear that was both irrational and utterly convincing, whether the figure would remain confined to the Kellner building, or whether it might appear elsewhere, might follow him somehow, might show up on other cameras in other locations, wearing his face and moving through his city like a shadow he could not escape. Carver spent his mandated day off in a state of restless anxiety that made sleep impossible and concentration on any normal activity feel absurd. He tried watching television, tried reading, tried going for a walk through his neighborhood, but every activity felt hollow and meaningless in the shadow of what he had experienced at the Kellner building. His mind kept returning to the image of himself on those security monitors, walking through empty hallways, reaching toward his own shoulder, existing in two places simultaneously according to the cameras while existing in only one place according to his direct perception. The contradiction gnawed at him with the persistence of physical pain. Around 8 in the evening, unable to tolerate the confinement of his apartment any longer, Carver got in his personal vehicle and drove toward Queens. He told himself he was simply going for a drive, that he needed to move and think, but his route took him inevitably toward the industrial district along Newtown Creek. He found himself driving past the Kellner manufacturing building, slowing as he approached to look at the dark structure. The parking lot was empty. No security guard vehicle, no patrol cars, nothing to indicate that anyone was monitoring the building tonight. Either Secure Watch had not yet assigned a replacement guard, or they had decided to suspend coverage until the situation was resolved. Carver parked across the street and sat watching the building for nearly an hour. He was not sure what he expected to see. The windows remained dark, the parking lot empty. Nothing moved in or around the structure. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, an abandoned manufacturing facility waiting for demolition or redevelopment. But Carver could not shake the feeling that something was present inside, something that the cameras had detected and recorded, something that existed in a way that human perception could not directly access. His phone rang, startling him out of his surveillance. The caller ID showed Sergeant Quinn's number. Carver answered, wondering what would prompt his supervisor to call him during his off time. "Carver? Where are you right now?" Quinn's voice carried a tension that immediately put Carver on alert. "I'm in Queens, near the industrial sector. Why?" "I need you to come to the precinct immediately. Something has happened, something you need to see." "What kind of something?" There was a pause on the line, and Carver could hear muffled conversation in the background before Quinn spoke again. "The phenomenon from the Kellner building. It's not confined to that location anymore. We have reports from 3 other sites across Queens, all showing similar anomalies on security camera footage. And Officer Carver, in every instance, the figure on the cameras is you." Carver felt ice spread through his chest. "What do you mean, 3 other sites?" "A warehouse on Northern Boulevard, a parking garage in Long Island City, and a storage facility in Maspeth. All 3 locations called in reports within the past 2 hours. Their security systems are showing a police officer moving through their buildings during times when no officer is present. The descriptions all match you. We need you to come in and help us figure out what's happening." Carver drove to the precinct with his mind racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. If the phenomenon was no longer isolated to the Kellner building, if it was appearing at multiple locations simultaneously, then whatever explanation might have applied to a single site broke down entirely. Technical malfunction could not account for unconnected security systems in different buildings, all producing the same anomalous images at the same time. This was something else, something that transcended the boundaries of individual locations and suggested a pattern or purpose that Carver could not begin to understand. The precinct was unusually busy for a weeknight when Carver arrived. Multiple patrol units were in the parking lot, and he could see officers coming and going from the building with the kind of urgent energy that accompanied major incidents. He found Quinn in the Situation Room, a conference space normally used for briefings that had been converted into a temporary command center. Large monitors had been set up displaying security camera feeds from multiple locations, and a dozen officers were gathered around them, watching and documenting what they showed. Quinn saw Carver enter and gestured him over. "We've been coordinating with the businesses that reported the incidents. They've given us remote access to their security system so we can monitor in real time. What you're about to see is happening right now across 4 different locations in Queens." Carver looked at the monitors and felt his sense of reality tilt sideways. Each screen showed security footage from a different building, but the same figure appeared in all of them. Carver in his uniform, moving through warehouses and parking structures and storage facilities, conducting what appeared to be systematic searches of each location. The movements were identical across all 4 sites, as though the same sequence of actions was being replayed simultaneously in multiple places. The figure would check a door, move down a hallway, examine a corner, then disappear from one camera's view only to appear on another, maintaining a consistent pattern that Carver recognized as his own search methodology. "How long has this been going on?" Carver asked, unable to look away from the screens. First report came in at 1900 hours from the warehouse on Northern Boulevard. Security guard there was doing his rounds and noticed unusual activity on his monitors. He called it in, thinking it might be an unauthorized person on the property. Responding unit confirmed no one was present, but the images persisted on the cameras. Since then, 2 more locations have reported similar activity. We're working under the assumption that there may be additional sites experiencing the same phenomenon but haven't reported it yet. One of the detectives in the room, a veteran named Halloran, whom Carver knew by reputation, turned from the monitors to address Quinn. "Sergeant, we've documented over 2 hours of footage across all 4 locations. The figure appears consistently, never deviating from the search pattern. But here's what I find particularly disturbing. Each location where the figure has appeared is a site that Officer Carver has responded to for legitimate calls within the past 6 months. The Kellner building, yes, but also these other 3. He's been to all of them in the course of his regular patrol duties." Carver felt a chill run through him. "You're saying this thing is appearing at places I've actually been? Places I've worked?" "That's what the response logs indicate. In each case, you responded to calls at these locations within the past 3 to 6 months. Different types of calls, different circumstances, but you were physically present at each site at some point. Whatever this phenomenon is, it seems to be connected to your actual patrol history." Quinn pulled Carver aside, away from the group of officers watching the monitors. "I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Have you been experiencing any unusual symptoms? Blackouts, missing time, periods where you can't account for your whereabouts?" "No, nothing like that. I'm fully aware of my location and activities at all times." "Any history of sleepwalking or other parasomnia conditions?" "No. Sergeant, what are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm eliminating possibilities. Because right now we have a situation where security systems across Queens are recording you conducting unauthorized searches of private property, but you're standing here in front of me and clearly not in those locations. Either the video evidence is false, which seems unlikely given the number of independent systems involved, or something is happening that we don't have a framework to understand." A patrol officer burst into the Situation Room, his expression urgent. "Sergeant Quinn, we just received another call. A residential building in Woodside." Super says their security cameras are showing a police officer in the basement storage area. Given the pattern, I'm betting it matches Officer Carver's description. Quinn turned to Carver. Have you ever responded to a call at a residential building in Woodside? Carver thought back through his recent assignments, sorting through the accumulated memory of hundreds of calls. Yes, about 4 months ago. Domestic disturbance on the 3rd floor. I was there for maybe 30 minutes taking statements and filing a report. But I never went to the basement, had no reason to access that area. But you were in the building, you were physically present at that location. For a completely unrelated call, yes. Quinn made a decision. We're going to that building now. I want you with me. If this phenomenon is appearing at a location in real time, I want to verify whether you experience anything unusual when we're on scene. Maybe there's some kind of interaction or feedback that will help us understand what's happening. They took Quinn's patrol SUV and drove through the evening traffic toward Woodside, a neighborhood that blended residential blocks with commercial corridors in the way that characterized much of Queens. The building was a 6-story apartment complex on Roosevelt Avenue, older construction from the 1960s but well-maintained. The superintendent was waiting for them in the lobby, a man in his 60s named Gus, who clearly wanted this situation resolved so he could return to his regular duties. "It's still happening," Gus said as soon as they entered. "I've been watching the monitor in my office. That cop is down there right now, walking around the storage cages checking locks. But I went down there myself 10 minutes ago and there's nobody there. Place is empty." He led them to his office, a small room off the lobby that held a desk, filing cabinets, and a security monitor showing feeds from cameras throughout the building. The basement camera showed exactly what Gus had described. The figure that wore Carver's face was moving through a corridor lined with storage cages, examining each one methodically. The image quality was not as clear as the commercial security systems, but the resemblance was unmistakable. "How long has your system been showing this?" Quinn asked. "Started maybe 45 minutes ago. I was doing paperwork and just happened to glance at the monitor. Thought we had an intruder. Called you guys immediately." Quinn turned to Carver. "I want you to go down to that basement. I want you to stand in the exact location where the figure is on camera and see if anything unusual occurs. I'll stay here and watch the monitor. Gus, can you escort Officer Carver to the basement?" Gus nodded and led Carver to a service elevator that descended below the main floor. The basement was a concrete-walled space divided into sections for utilities, laundry facilities, and the storage cages that tenants rented for belongings they did not have room for in their apartments. The fluorescent lighting was harsh and flickering in places, casting unstable shadows across the floor. Carver could hear the hum of the building's heating system and the occasional clank of pipes expanding and contracting. They found the corridor with the storage cages, a narrow passage with chain-link enclosures on both sides. Gus pointed to a spot about halfway down the corridor. "That's where he is on the camera right now. Standing right there looking at the cage on the left." Carver walked to the indicated location and stood facing the storage cage. It contained the kind of miscellaneous items people accumulated over years. Boxes of old books, a broken lamp, some sporting equipment. Nothing unusual or notable. Carver waited, trying to perceive any sensation that might indicate the presence of something beyond normal reality. He felt nothing. The basement was cold and slightly damp, but there was no indication of anything anomalous occurring. His radio crackled and Quinn's voice came through. "Carver, I'm watching the monitor. You're standing in the exact same position as the figure on camera. From this angle, it looks like there are 2 of you occupying the same space. One is you physically present, which I know is real because we just watched you walk down there. The other is the figure on the security feed, which is also clearly visible. Both versions are standing in identical positions, facing the same direction. It's like seeing a double exposure photograph, but in real time. Carver looked around the basement corridor, seeing nothing but concrete walls and storage cages and the flickering fluorescent lights. I don't perceive anything unusual down here. No sense of another presence. No physical sensations. Try moving. Walk down the corridor and see if the figure on camera follows your movement or maintains its own pattern. Carver walked slowly down the corridor, passing the rows of storage cages. He could hear Quinn's voice providing commentary through the radio, describing what she was seeing on the monitor. According to her description, the figure on camera was not following his movement. It remained in its original position, continuing its examination of the storage cages independently of Carver's actual location. The two versions of him were performing different actions in the same space, one visible to human perception and one visible only to the security camera. After several minutes of this surreal exercise, Quinn called him back upstairs. Gus had been recording the security footage and had made a copy for the police investigation. They watched it together in his office, seeing both versions of Carver occupying the basement simultaneously, moving independently, existing in what appeared to be parallel but separate realities. "This is beyond anything I can explain," Quinn said quietly. "This isn't a technical glitch. This isn't someone playing a prank. This is something that defies explanation within any framework I understand." They returned to the precinct where the Situation Room had grown more crowded with officers and detectives trying to make sense of the accumulating evidence. 2 additional locations had reported similar phenomena, while Carver and Quinn were at the Woodside building. The pattern was accelerating, spreading to more sites, appearing with greater frequency. And in every instance, the figure on the cameras wore Carver's face and moved through spaces he had previously visited in the course of his duties. Detective Halloran had been coordinating with the city's technical resources, trying to find any expert who might offer insight into what was happening. I spoke with someone from the Forensic Video Analysis Unit. They reviewed samples of the footage and confirmed it's not deepfake technology or digital manipulation. The images are genuine recordings of what the cameras are seeing in real time. I also contacted a professor at Columbia who studies anomalous phenomena. His theory, and I want to stress this is completely speculative, is that we might be witnessing some kind of temporal echo. The cameras are somehow recording actions that Officer Carver performed in the past at these locations, replaying them in the present. Like a residual haunting, but captured on electronic media instead of human perception. "That's insane," one of the patrol officers said. "Cameras don't record ghosts. Cameras record light," Halloran replied. "If something is emitting or reflecting light in a way that our eyes can't perceive, but camera sensors can, then yes, cameras might record things that appear invisible to human observation. I'm not saying I believe this explanation. I'm saying it's the closest thing to a theory that anyone has offered that accounts for what we're observing." Carver listened to this discussion with a growing sense of unreality. The conversation had moved beyond police work into territory that belonged in science fiction or paranormal investigation. But the evidence was undeniable. Something was appearing on security cameras across Queens, something that looked exactly like him, and no conventional explanation could account for it. Quinn made the decision that Carver was to be placed on administrative leave until the situation was resolved. It was not punitive, she emphasized, but practical. If his presence at locations seemed to trigger or intensify the phenomenon, then keeping him away from patrol duties might help contain it. Carver accepted this decision without argument, recognizing that he had become more of a liability than an asset to the department's operations. He drove home in the early morning hours, exhausted but unable to sleep. He sat in his apartment watching the sun rise over Astoria and tried to understand what was happening to him. Why was this occurring? What had he done to trigger it? Was there some action he had taken, some threshold he had crossed, that had opened him up to this impossible situation? The questions multiplied without producing answers, leaving him trapped in a maze of uncertainty that grew more complex with each attempt to find a way out. His phone buzzed with a text message from Quinn. New development. Check the news. Carver opened a news website and found the story immediately on the front page. Multiple businesses across Queens were reporting strange security camera footage showing what appeared to be the same police officer appearing at different locations simultaneously. The story was framed as a potential security breach or coordinated surveillance operation, with business owners demanding answers from the NYPD about why an officer would be conducting unauthorized searches of private property. The department would have to make a statement soon, would have to offer some explanation that the public could accept. But what could they say? How could they explain something that violated the basic principles of physical reality? Carver understood that his life was about to become very complicated, that he was about to be thrust into a spotlight he had never wanted, examined and questioned and doubted by people who would never believe the truth because the truth was fundamentally unbelievable. He turned off his phone and closed his curtains, retreating into the darkness of his apartment. Outside, the city continued its normal operations. Millions of people going about their lives in a reality that made sense. But Carver was no longer part of that reality. He had slipped sideways into something else, some parallel existence where the rules did not apply, and the boundaries between possible and impossible had dissolved. And he had no idea how to find his way back. The NYPD held a press conference 3 days after the phenomenon began spreading across Queens. Carver watched it from his apartment on a news live stream, seeing the department spokesperson stand behind a podium and deliver carefully crafted statements that acknowledged the security camera incidents while offering no real explanation for them. Technical anomalies were being investigated. No criminal activity had been identified. The department was working with private security firms and technology experts to determine the cause of the unusual footage. Officer Hollis Carver was cooperating fully with the internal investigation and was currently on administrative leave pending resolution of the matter. The spokesperson took no questions from the assembled reporters, ending the conference after less than 10 minutes of vague reassurances that convinced no one. Carver's phone had been ringing constantly since his name was made public. Reporters wanting interviews, colleagues calling to check on him, even a few conspiracy theorists who somehow obtained his number and wanted to discuss government surveillance programs or alien technology. He stopped answering after the first day, letting the calls go to voicemail and deleting the messages without listening to them. He had nothing to say that would satisfy anyone's curiosity, and he was tired of trying to explain something he himself did not understand. The phenomenon continued to spread. By the end of the first week, over 30 locations across Queens had reported similar security camera anomalies. The figure that wore Carver's face appeared at warehouses and apartment buildings, parking structures and retail stores, always moving through the spaces with the same methodical search pattern, always visible only on camera feeds while remaining undetectable to human perception. The pattern of appearances seemed to follow Carver's historical patrol routes, manifesting at sites he had visited during his 6 years working the industrial sector. It was as though his accumulated presence at these locations had left some kind of residue that cameras could detect, a ghost of past actions replaying themselves in the present. Detective Halloran called Carver on the 8th day with an update that made the situation even more disturbing. "We've been analyzing the footage from all 30-plus locations, looking for patterns in timing and behavior. What we've found is that the figure's movements are not random. It's searching for something. At each location it follows a specific route, checks specific areas, as though it knows exactly where to look. And Officer Carver, the routes it's following are not routes you actually took when you responded to calls at these places. They're routes you would have taken if you had been conducting systematic searches rather than responding to specific incidents. I don't understand what that means, Carver said, though a cold certainty was forming in his mind. It means the figure isn't just replaying your past actions. It's performing actions you never took but theoretically could have taken. It's showing alternative versions of your patrols, searches that might have occurred in different circumstances. We're not looking at recordings of the past. We're looking at recordings of possible pasts or parallel actions that exist in some other timeline or reality. Carver sat in his apartment digesting this information, trying to comprehend its implications. If Halloran's theory was correct, then the cameras were somehow accessing alternate versions of reality, showing events that had not occurred in this timeline but had occurred in others. And the central figure in all these alternate realities was Carver himself, endlessly searching, endlessly patrolling, performing his duties across multiple versions of Queens that existed simultaneously in different dimensions or states of being. Has anyone tried to interact with it? Carver asked. Has anyone been present at a location when the figure appears and attempted to make contact? Yes. Multiple officers have tried. The figure doesn't respond to verbal commands or physical approach. It continues its search pattern regardless of what happens around it. It's like watching a recording that can't be paused or altered. Whatever it is, it's operating according to its own internal logic, completely independent of our reality. After the call ended, Carver found himself unable to stay in his apartment any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the isolation was becoming unbearable. He needed to move, needed to do something active rather than sitting and waiting for this situation to resolve itself. He got in his car and drove aimlessly through Queens, not heading anywhere specific but simply needing to be in motion. He found himself driving through the industrial sector, following the patrol routes he had driven thousands of times over his 6 years on the force. The streets were familiar in a way that transcended conscious memory, encoded in muscle and reflex from endless repetition. He knew which turns to take, which intersections to watch, which buildings were likely to have problems. This knowledge had been accumulated gradually, shift by shift, until it became as natural as breathing. And now that accumulated presence was somehow manifesting on security cameras across the borough. His past self or alternate self or whatever it was appearing at all the places he had been, conducting searches he had never performed but might have performed under different circumstances. Carver pulled over near the Kellner manufacturing building where this had all started. The structure looked abandoned and forgotten in the afternoon light, no different from dozens of other industrial buildings in the area. But this was where Fenwick had first seen the figure on camera, where Carver had climbed to the 3rd floor and stood in a hallway while the cameras recorded 2 versions of him occupying the same space. This was ground zero for whatever had been unleashed, and Carver felt drawn to it with a compulsion he could not fully explain. He got out of his car and approached the main entrance. The doors were still locked, the building still vacant. But as Carver stood looking at the dark windows, he saw movement on the 3rd floor. Just a flicker, a shadow passing behind the glass, there and gone in an instant. He stared at the window, waiting for it to appear again, but saw nothing more. Probably just a trick of light, a reflection or illusion produced by the angle of the sun. But Carver could not shake the feeling that something was inside that building, something that existed in the spaces between what cameras recorded and what eyes could see. His phone rang. Quinn's number. He answered, expecting another update about the investigation or a request for additional information. Instead, Quinn's voice carried an urgency that immediately alarmed him. "Carver, where are you right now?" "I'm at the Kellner building. Why?" "You need to leave that location immediately. We just received a report from the building owner's insurance company. They sent a contractor to inspect the structure this morning as part of their coverage review. The contractor found something in the basement that we need to investigate. A room that's not on the building plans. A space that shouldn't exist according to the architectural records. And Officer Carver, there's something in that room. Something the contractor described as a shrine. Carver felt ice spread through his chest. A shrine to what? To you. The contractor said the room is covered wall to wall with photographs and documents related to you. Your patrol logs, copies of reports you filed, surveillance photos of you on duty. Someone has been collecting information about you and storing it in that building. We're sending units to secure the scene right now, but I need you away from that location until we can clear it and determine whether there's an active threat. Carver looked up at the building, at the third-floor window where he had seen movement moments before. Someone had been inside, had created a space dedicated to monitoring and documenting his activities. Someone had been watching him, following him, collecting evidence of his presence across Queens. And somehow that obsessive attention had manifested in the security camera phenomenon, had created conditions where his image could appear at locations he had visited, replaying and reimagining his patrols across multiple sites simultaneously. Who would do this? Carver asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. We don't know yet. Could be someone with a grudge against you specifically, or against police in general. Could be someone experiencing a delusional episode who fixated on you for reasons we can't predict. The forensic team will process the scene and will work to identify who created this room and why. But until we know what we're dealing with, I want you in a safe location with other officers present. Carver agreed and drove to the precinct, his mind racing through the implications of Quinn's discovery. Someone had been obsessively documenting his work, creating a shrine to his patrol activities in the basement of an abandoned building. That obsessive focus had somehow, through mechanisms Carver could not begin to understand, created conditions where security cameras across Queens began recording alternate versions of his presence, showing him conducting searches at locations he had visited, manifesting his image in spaces where he was not physically present. The cameras were not malfunctioning or being hacked. They were recording something real, some kind of psychic or quantum resonance that had been generated by someone's intense attention to Carver's existence. The forensic team processed the hidden room in the Kellner building over the next 48 hours, documenting thousands of photographs and hundreds of pages of handwritten notes that detailed Carver's movements over the course of several years. The level of surveillance was extraordinary, suggesting someone with significant resources and time had devoted themselves entirely to following and recording Carver's activities. But despite the wealth of evidence, no identification of the person responsible emerged. The handwriting could not be matched to any known individual. The photographs had been taken with a common camera model that could not be traced. The room itself had been constructed secretly, accessed through a service corridor that the building owner had not known existed. Whoever had created this shrine had done so with paranoid attention to remaining anonymous. Detective Halloran presented his findings to Carver in a conference room at the precinct, laying out photographs of the shrine alongside analysis of the security camera footage. What we're looking at is consistent with a pattern of obsessive fixation. Someone became focused on your activities to the point of complete absorption. They documented every patrol, every call, every action you took in the course of your duties. That level of attention, that intensity of focus, appears to have created some kind of resonance effect. The security cameras are picking up echoes of your presence, recordings of paths you took and paths you might have taken, all generated by this person's obsessive mapping of your existence. How is that possible? Carver asked. How can someone's attention to me create physical effects that cameras can record? I don't have an answer that would satisfy a scientific explanation. But there are theories in quantum mechanics about how observation affects reality, how the act of measuring something changes its state. If consciousness can affect quantum systems at microscopic scales, maybe intense focused attention can affect reality at larger scales in ways we don't normally detect. The cameras might be sensitive to these effects in ways that human perception is not, recording changes in reality that are too subtle for us to see directly, but are captured by electronic sensors. It was the closest thing to an explanation that anyone had offered, though it raised more questions than it answered. Carver left the conference room feeling no closer to understanding what had happened to him than he had been when this started. The shrine had been discovered and documented, but its creator remained unknown. The security camera phenomenon continued unabated, with new locations reporting sightings of the figure every day. Carver's image was now appearing at sites across not just Queens, but also Brooklyn and Manhattan, spreading beyond the boundaries of his actual patrol sector to encompass the entire city. The department kept Carver on administrative leave indefinitely, unable to return him to active duty while his image continued to appear on security cameras throughout the 5 boroughs. He became a subject of intense media speculation, with theories ranging from secret government experiments to alien abduction to mass hallucination induced by some unknown toxin. None of the theories came close to capturing the reality of what Carver had experienced, the profound disorientation of seeing yourself exist in multiple places simultaneously, of knowing that your presence had been recorded and replicated across the city in ways that defied explanation. Weeks passed. The phenomenon did not stop or diminish. If anything, it intensified, with the figure appearing more frequently and at more locations. Carver stopped watching the news coverage and avoided reading the speculation online. He existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully part of normal reality nor able to escape into some alternative explanation that would make sense of his situation. He was trapped in limbo, watching himself perform duties he could no longer actually perform, seeing his image conduct patrols he was no longer authorized to make. 3 months after the initial incident at the Kellner building, Carver received a call from Detective Halloran with news that changed everything. "We found something in the shrine, something we missed during the initial processing, hidden behind a false panel in one of the walls. It's a journal, handwritten, hundreds of pages. The person who created that room documented everything, including their reasoning and methodology. Officer Carver, I think you need to read this. It explains what's happening and why." Carver met Halloran at the precinct and was given a copy of the journal, the original being held as evidence. He took it back to his apartment and spent the entire night reading it, following the thoughts of someone whose identity remained unknown, but whose obsession with Carver was documented in excruciating detail. The journal writer claimed to have developed a method for imprinting consciousness onto physical space, for creating permanent records of observation that would persist beyond the observer's direct presence. By documenting Carver's patrols with obsessive precision, by photographing and mapping every movement, the writer believed they were creating a form of immortality, preserving Carver's actions in a way that would outlast physical death. The journal's final entries described a ritual performed in the hidden room, a process of sustained meditation and focused attention intended to permanently bind Carver's recorded presence to the locations he had patrolled. The writer claimed this binding had been successful, that Carver's image would now appear eternally on any surveillance system that captured those locations, a ghost of observation that would never fade. The journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted or had simply stopped writing without completing their final thought. Carver read the journal twice, trying to understand the mindset of someone who would devote years of their life to such an endeavor. The obsession was clear, but the motivation remained opaque. Did the writer admire Carver, fear him, simply find him a convenient subject for their experiment in consciousness preservation. The journal provided no clear answer, leaving Carver with the unsettling knowledge that someone had fundamentally altered his existence without his knowledge or consent, had bound him to the city in ways that could not be undone. Detective Halloran's attempts to identify the journal's author led nowhere. Handwriting analysis suggested someone with technical training, possibly engineering or architecture based on the precise drawings and measurements included in the notes. But no matches were found in any database. The fingerprints recovered from the journal pages belonged to no one in any criminal or civil records. The person who had done this had successfully remained anonymous, leaving behind only their work and its permanent consequences. Carver resigned from the NYPD 4 months after the phenomenon began. He could not return to active duty, and continuing on administrative leave felt like existing in a purgatory that served no purpose. The department accepted his resignation with the kind of relief that came from resolving a problem that had no good solution. They provided him with his pension benefits and a letter of recommendation that carefully avoided mentioning the circumstances of his departure. Carver left the precinct for the last time on a cold January afternoon, walking out into a city that he no longer belonged to in the same way he once had. He moved out of Queens entirely, relocating to a small town upstate where he had no history and no accumulated presence. He found work in private security, a job that kept him away from patrol duties and surveillance systems. He tried to build a life that did not involve the constant awareness of his duplicated self appearing on cameras throughout New York City. But he could not escape the knowledge that somewhere in Queens, in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, security systems were still recording his image, still showing him conducting eternal patrols through buildings he would never enter again. His ghost continued its work, searching and documenting and existing in a state between reality and observation that Carver had become permanently bound to. Sometimes, late at night when he could not sleep, Carver would open his laptop and search for news about the phenomenon. The reports continued, though they received less attention as the novelty wore off and the city moved on to other mysteries. Business owners had grown accustomed to seeing the figure on their security feeds, treating it as a strange but harmless quirk of their systems. Some had even begun using it as a selling point, advertising their buildings as featuring the famous Ghost Cop of Queens. The figure that wore Carver's face had become part of the city's infrastructure, as permanent and unremarkable as the subway system or the street grid. Carver tried not to think about what this meant for his existence, tried not to dwell on the fact that a version of him would continue performing duties he had abandoned, patrolling streets he no longer walked, existing in electronic perpetuity long after his physical body had died. He tried to focus on his new life in his new town, but the awareness was always there, just beneath the surface of his thoughts. He had been bound to the city in ways that transcended physical presence, and that binding would never break. 1 year after the initial incident, Carver received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, taken from a security camera, showing him standing in the third-floor hallway of the Kellner Manufacturing Building. But in this photograph, taken just days earlier, according to the timestamp, Carver was not alone. 2 figures stood in the hallway. One was the familiar ghost that had appeared on cameras throughout the city. The other was Carver himself, his physical self, standing in a location he had not visited in over a year. Both versions of him were looking directly at the camera, both wearing identical expressions that Carver could not quite interpret. Recognition, perhaps, or warning, or some communication from a version of himself that existed in the space between observation and reality. Carver did not return to the city to investigate. He placed the photograph in a drawer and tried to forget about it, though he knew forgetting was impossible. The photograph was a message from his duplicated self, proof that the phenomenon had evolved beyond its initial parameters. The figure was no longer confined to historical patrol routes or buildings Carver had actually visited. It was appearing in new locations, expanding its territory, operating according to logic that had nothing to do with Carver's actual choices or movements. It had become autonomous, a version of him that existed independently, pursuing its own objectives in its own reality. Years would pass. Carver would age and change, building a life in his small upstate town that bore little resemblance to his years as a police officer in Queens. But in the city, his ghost would continue its eternal patrol, appearing on security cameras in an ever-expanding network of locations, searching and documenting and existing in a state that was neither fully present nor fully absent. People who encountered it on their security feeds would wonder about the story behind it, would speculate and theorize and eventually accept it as just another unexplained phenomenon in a city full of mysteries that defied explanation. And sometimes, in moments of weakness or curiosity, Carver would check the online forums where people discussed sightings of the ghost cop. He would read their theories and their analyses, their attempts to understand what they were seeing. He never posted or contributed to these discussions, never revealed his identity or shared his knowledge of the phenomenon's origins. He remained silent, watching from a distance as his duplicated self performed duties he had abandoned, existing in a reality he could no longer access but could never fully escape. He was bound to the city through observation, through the obsessive attention of someone who had seen him and decided to preserve him, to make him eternal in the only way they knew how. And that binding would persist long after Carver's physical death. His image continuing to appear on cameras throughout New York, a permanent ghost of observation that would never stop searching, never stop patrolling, never stop existing in the liminal space between what was real and what was recorded. Trooper Silas Moreau had been working the overnight shift on Route 17 for 11 years, and in that time he had developed an almost meditative relationship with the highway. The road cut through the Catskill Mountains in a series of long curves that demanded constant attention during daylight hours, but became hypnotic at night when traffic thinned to nearly nothing. Most troopers hated the isolation of highway patrol, the endless hours of driving through darkness, with only the radio for company and the occasional traffic stop to break the monotony. But Moreau found something peaceful in it, a kind of solitude that allowed him to think clearly in ways that the chaos of urban policing never permitted. Out here on the highway, problems were straightforward. Speeders, drunk drivers, mechanical failures, accidents. The work followed predictable patterns, and Moreau had learned to read those patterns the way other people read books. The call came through dispatch at 2:37 on a Thursday morning in late November. A motorist had used the emergency call box at mile marker 84 to report a disabled vehicle blocking the right lane. The caller had provided minimal information before the connection dropped, which was not unusual in this part of the mountains where cell coverage was spotty and the old call box system was the most reliable way to summon help. Moreau was 15 miles south of the location, finishing up paperwork on a routine traffic stop, when he acknowledged the call and turned north toward mile marker 84. The night was unusually foggy for this time of year, a thick ground fog that reduced visibility to less than 100 feet and made the highway's white lane markers barely visible. Moreau drove slowly, his emergency lights off to avoid creating glare in the fog, watching for the disabled vehicle that should be somewhere ahead. Traffic was non-existent at this hour. He had not passed another vehicle in over 20 minutes, which meant whoever had called in the disabled car was either still with their vehicle or had managed to get a ride from someone else before Moreau arrived. He reached mile marker 84 and found nothing. No disabled vehicle, no person waiting by the roadside, No debris or signs of mechanical failure. Moreau pulled onto the shoulder and activated his emergency lights, then exited his vehicle to check the area more thoroughly. The fog swirled around him in the red and blue strobe of his light bar, creating disorienting patterns that made it difficult to judge distances. He walked along the shoulder in both directions, checking for any evidence that a vehicle had been here recently. Tire marks, fluid leaks, personal items that might have been left behind. He found nothing. Moreau returned to his patrol vehicle and radioed dispatch to report that the location was clear. The dispatcher, a woman named Eleanor Brandt, who had been working the overnight communications desk for as long as Moreau had been on highway patrol, responded with a note of confusion in her voice. "Troop Charlie 7, you're saying there's no vehicle at that location? The call came in less than 10 minutes ago. Caller reported a sedan blocking the right lane." "That's affirmative, dispatch. I've checked both directions from mile marker 84. Nothing on the road, nothing on the shoulder. Either the caller was mistaken about the location, or the vehicle was moved before I arrived." "Copy that, Charlie 7. I'll note it in the log. Call box at that location has been problematic lately. We've had several false activations over the past few weeks. Maintenance is supposed to check it out, but they keep pushing it back." Moreau was about to acknowledge and clear the call when his headlights caught movement in the fog ahead. A figure was walking along the shoulder, moving slowly toward him. Moreau immediately tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. People on foot on the highway at night were almost always in some kind of distress or danger, and approaching them required caution. He activated his spotlight and aimed it at the figure, calling out through his vehicle's PA system. "This is New York State Police. Stop where you are and show me your hands." The figure stopped walking and raised both hands, palms out, in a gesture of compliance. Moreau could see now that it was a woman, maybe in her 30s or 40s, wearing what appeared to be a light jacket, inadequate for the November cold. She was not dressed for walking along a highway at night. No reflective gear, no flashlight, nothing that would make her visible to passing vehicles. Moreau exited his patrol car and approached her carefully, his flashlight in one hand. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need assistance?" The woman lowered her hands slowly and looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read in the poor lighting and fog. She appeared disoriented, possibly in shock. "My car broke down. I called for help, but no one came. I started walking to find a phone. Where's your vehicle?" She pointed back the way she had been walking toward the north. "About a mile that way, maybe less, I'm not sure. Everything looks the same in this fog." Moreau noticed several things about the woman that triggered his professional instincts. Her clothing was damp but not soaked, despite the heavy fog. Her shoes were inappropriate for walking on a highway shoulder, thin-soled flats that would have been uncomfortable after any significant distance. Most notably, she showed no signs of cold despite wearing only a light jacket in temperatures that were well below freezing. No shivering, no visible breath vapor, no reddening of exposed skin from the cold air. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Eleanor. Eleanor Brandt." Moreau felt something cold settle in his chest at the name. Eleanor Brandt was the dispatcher he had just been speaking with, currently sitting at her communications desk 15 miles away at the troop barracks. This woman could not be Eleanor Brandt, unless there was some extraordinary coincidence of names. But the specific combination of first and last name, spoken without hesitation, made coincidence seem unlikely. "Can I see some identification, please?" The woman reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a driver's license, handing it to Moreau. He examined it under his flashlight. The license showed a New York State ID with a photograph that matched the woman standing in front of him. The name was indeed Eleanor Brandt, with an address in Kingston, about 40 miles south of their current location. The license had expired. Not recently, but 20 years ago. The expiration date was November 2004. Ma'am, this license is expired. Do you have current identification? Eleanor looked at the license in his hand with confusion. That can't be right. I just renewed it last month. There must be some mistake. Moreau's training had prepared him for many types of encounters with distressed motorists. But this situation was falling outside those parameters in ways that made him increasingly uneasy. He radioed dispatch, keeping his voice calm and professional, even though his instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. Dispatch, Charlie 7. I've made contact with a female pedestrian at mile marker 84. She states her vehicle is disabled approximately 1 mile north of this location. I'm going to transport her to her vehicle and assess the situation. Can you run a license check for me? Eleanor Brandt, date of birth shows as March 15, 1969. There was a long pause before the dispatcher, the real Eleanor Brandt, responded. When she did, her voice carried a note of shock that even her professional training could not fully conceal. Charlie 7, did you say Eleanor Brandt? Can you confirm that name? Affirmative. Eleanor Brandt. License shows an address in Kingston. Another pause, longer this time. Moreau could hear typing in the background, the sound of someone searching databases. Finally, Eleanor's voice came back, and now it was tight with something that might have been fear or disbelief. Trooper Moreau, I need you to be very careful with that individual. That name is flagged in our system. There's a notation from 20 years ago. I'm pulling up the file now. What kind of notation? It's a fatality record. Eleanor Brandt was killed in a single vehicle accident on Route 17 in November 2004. The accident occurred at mile marker 85, approximately 1 mile north of your current location. Moreau looked at the woman standing before him, who was watching him with an expression of patient waiting, as though she had not heard the radio transmission or did not understand its implications. The license in his hand felt suddenly heavy, weighted with significance that went beyond its physical reality. He was holding identification for a woman who had been dead for 20 years, handed to him by someone who looked exactly like the photograph on that license, standing at the precise location where that woman had died 2 decades earlier. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me. We're going to sort this out at the barracks. But my car, I need to get back to my car. My daughter is waiting for me at home. I need to get back. Moreau's unease deepened. The case file for Eleanor Brandt's fatal accident would contain details about whether she had been alone in the vehicle or if there had been passengers. If this woman was somehow connected to that accident, either as a surviving relative or someone exploiting the tragedy for some unimaginable purpose, the mention of a daughter might provide a connection point for understanding what was happening. How old is your daughter, ma'am? She just turned 7. Her birthday was last week. I promised her I'd be home before she woke up for school. She gets scared when I'm not there in the morning. Moreau did the mental math. If this woman's daughter had turned 7 last week, she would have been born in 2017, 13 years after Eleanor Brandt's death. The timeline made no sense unless the woman standing before him was delusional or was providing false information for reasons Moreau could not yet determine. He decided to take a different approach. Ma'am, what year is it? Eleanor looked at him as though the question was absurd. It's 2004, November 18th. Why are you asking me these things? I just need help with my car. 20 years in the past, the exact date, Moreau realized with growing certainty, when Eleanor Brandt had died on this highway. He had encountered many confused or disoriented motorists during his career, people in shock from accidents or suffering from medical conditions that affected their cognition. But this woman showed no signs of physical injury or impairment. She spoke clearly and coherently, providing consistent information that just happened to be 20 years out of date and aligned precisely with the fatal accident that had occurred at this location. "Ma'am, I need you to get in my patrol car. We're going to take a drive and sort this out." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded and allowed Moreau to guide her to the passenger side of his vehicle. He opened the rear door, as procedure required for anyone being transported who was not under arrest, but also not simply receiving a courtesy ride. Eleanor climbed in without protest, settling into the seat with the same patient compliance she had shown throughout the encounter. Moreau closed the door and returned to the driver's seat, his mind racing through protocols and possibilities. He radioed dispatch again. "Dispatch, I'm transporting the individual to her reported vehicle location 1 mile north. Request you pull the full accident report for the Eleanor Brandt fatality from November 2004 and have it ready for my review when I return to the barracks." "Copy that, Charlie 7. I've already requested the file from archives. It should be ready when you get back. Please be advised, this situation is highly unusual, and I recommend extreme caution in your interactions with this individual." Moreau drove north slowly, his emergency lights still activated, peering through the fog for any sign of a disabled vehicle. The woman in his back seat sat quietly, looking out the window as though she recognized the landscape even though the fog made it impossible to see more than a few dozen feet in any direction. As they approached mile marker 85, Moreau's headlights caught the edge of something reflective on the shoulder. He slowed further and saw it was a vehicle. A sedan pulled partially onto the grass beyond the paved shoulder. The car was an older model Honda, maybe from the early 2000s based on the body style. It sat at an angle that suggested it had pulled over hastily or been pushed off the road. Moreau stopped his patrol vehicle behind it and activated his spotlight, illuminating the sedan. The rear license plate was clearly visible. He called it in to dispatch, reading off the number. Eleanor's voice came back within seconds, and now she was not even trying to hide her shock. "Charlie 7. That plate number is registered to Eleanor Brandt from the 2004 records. That's the vehicle she was driving when she died. The car was totaled in the accident and should have been scrapped 20 years ago." Moreau sat in his patrol car, staring at the sedan illuminated in his spotlight, and felt reality tilt in a way he had never experienced before. This could not be the same vehicle from the fatal accident. Cars did not unwreck themselves and reappear on highways 2 decades after being destroyed. But the license plate matched, and when he looked more carefully at the sedan's body, he could see damage consistent with a serious accident. The front end was crumpled, the hood bent upward at an unnatural angle, the windshield shattered. This was not a disabled vehicle that had simply broken down. This was a wreck. He turned to look at Eleanor in his back seat. She was watching the sedan through the window with an expression of recognition and concern. "That's my car. I don't know what happened. The engine just died and I couldn't restart it. I need to call a tow truck." "Ma'am, that vehicle has been in an accident, significant damage to the front end. Were you involved in a collision?" No, I just pulled over when the engine died. There was no accident. I don't understand what you're showing me." Moreau exited his patrol car and approached the sedan cautiously, his flashlight sweeping across its surface. The damage was extensive and clearly not recent. Rust had formed around the crumpled metal. The broken windshield was weathered and dirty, and when Moreau looked inside through the driver's side window, he saw that the interior was covered in a layer of dust and debris that suggested the vehicle had been abandoned for years, not minutes or hours. But sitting on the passenger seat, clearly visible in his flashlight beam, was a child's backpack, bright pink with cartoon characters printed on the fabric. The backpack looked new, out of place in the deteriorated interior of the wrecked vehicle. Moreau tried the door handle and found it unlocked. He opened the door carefully and reached for the backpack, pulling it out to examine it more closely. Inside the backpack were school supplies and a homework folder with a name written on the front. The handwriting was childish, the letters formed with the careful precision of someone still learning to write. The name read Lily Brandt, and beneath the name was a date, written in a teacher's more practiced hand, November 18th, 2004. Moreau stood by the open car door, holding a backpack that should not exist, looking at a vehicle that should have been destroyed 20 years ago, with a woman in his patrol car who claimed to be someone who had been dead for 2 decades. Every rational explanation he could construct collapsed under the weight of what he was directly observing. This was not a case of mistaken identity or elaborate hoax. This was something that violated the basic rules of reality as he understood them. He returned to his patrol car where Eleanor sat watching him with an expression that was becoming increasingly desperate. "Did you find Lily's backpack? She left it in the car this morning. She'll need it for school tomorrow." "Ma'am, I need you to tell me what happened tonight. From the beginning. Why were you on this highway?" Eleanor's expression shifted to confusion, as though the question itself made no sense. "I was driving home from work. I work the night shift at the hospital in Liberty. I take Route 17 home every night. It's the fastest way to get back to Kingston. But my car broke down and I couldn't get it started again. That's why I called for help. Why are you asking me all these questions? I just need to get home to my daughter." Moreau pulled out his phone and searched for information about the Eleanor Brandt fatal accident from 2004. The news reports were still archived online, and what he read confirmed everything dispatch had told him. Eleanor Brandt, 35 years old, had been killed when her vehicle left the roadway on Route 17 near mile marker 85 on the night of November 18th, 2004. She had been driving home from her shift at Liberty Hospital when her car apparently struck the guardrail and rolled multiple times. She had been pronounced dead at the scene. The investigating trooper's report noted that weather conditions had been poor that night, with heavy fog reducing visibility. Eleanor had a 7-year-old daughter named Lily, who survived her mother. Moreau looked up from his phone at the woman in his back seat. She met his gaze with eyes that were becoming increasingly frightened, as though she was beginning to sense that something was terribly wrong, even if she could not articulate what it was. This woman, whoever or whatever she was, believed completely that she was Eleanor Brandt driving home from work on November 18th, 2004, unaware that she had died that night and that 20 years had passed since the accident that had taken her life. Moreau sat in his patrol car with the engine running, the heater fighting against the November cold, and tried to formulate a plan for handling a situation that had no precedent in any training manual or protocol he had ever studied. He had a woman in his back seat who believed she was Eleanor Brandt, driving home from work on the night she had actually died 20 years ago. He had a wrecked vehicle on the shoulder that matched the description of the car from that fatal accident, despite the impossibility of such a vehicle existing in its current state. And he had a child's backpack with homework dated to the exact night of the accident, sitting on his passenger seat as physical evidence of something that defied rational explanation. The most immediate practical question was what to do with the woman. He could not arrest her because she had committed no crime. He could not simply drive away and leave her on the highway because she was clearly in some kind of distress, even if that distress existed outside normal parameters of reality. And he could not take her to the barracks and process her through standard procedures because what would he even document? That he had encountered a ghost? That a woman dead for 20 years had called in a disabled vehicle report and was now sitting in his patrol car asking about her daughter? Moreau made a decision that was part professional procedure and part instinct born from 11 years of dealing with people in crisis. He would treat Eleanor as he would any confused or disoriented motorist with respect and care, while simultaneously investigating the situation as thoroughly as possible. He radioed dispatch and requested that Sergeant Chief Gideon Lake respond to his location. Lake had been with the state police for 30 years and had worked as the investigating officer on the original Eleanor Brandt fatality. If anyone would understand the implications of what Moreau was experiencing, it would be Lake. "Dispatch, this is Charlie 7. I need a supervisor to respond to mile marker 85 on Route 17. Request Sergeant Lake if he's available. This is a priority situation that requires his specific expertise." The dispatcher, the real Eleanor Brandt, whose name had been borrowed by whatever entity was sitting in Moreau's back seat, responded with clear understanding of what he was really asking. "Copy that, Charlie 7. Sergeant Lake is currently at the barracks. I'll contact him immediately and request he respond to your location. ETA approximately 20 minutes. Moreau turned in his seat to look at the woman behind the partition. She was staring out the window at the wrecked Honda, her expression troubled. "That's not my car," she said quietly. "I mean, it has my license plate, but that's not what my car looks like. My car isn't damaged like that. Someone must have switched the plates. This is all very confusing. Ma'am, I have a supervisor coming to help sort this out. In the meantime, I need you to think carefully and tell me the last thing you remember before your car broke down. What were you thinking about? What was happening?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. It carried a weight of realization, as though something that had been obscured was beginning to come into focus. "I was thinking about Lily, about how I needed to be home before she woke up. She's been having nightmares lately, scared of the dark, and she needs me there when she wakes up. I was driving too fast, I think. The fog was bad and I couldn't see the road very well, but I kept thinking I needed to get home, needed to be there for her. And then she trailed off, her eyes losing focus as though she was trying to recall something that kept slipping away." Moreau waited, not pushing, letting her work through whatever memory or realization was emerging. Finally, she continued, and now her voice was barely above a whisper. "And then there was a light, very bright, coming from the side. I thought it was another car, but it was in the wrong place, too high up. I turned the wheel to avoid it, and the car went off the road. I remember the feeling of losing control, the way everything seemed to happen very slowly even though I know it must have been fast. And then, nothing. Just fog and cold and walking along the highway looking for help." "What's the last date you remember clearly, before tonight?" "November 18th, 2004. It's my daughter's school conference day. I was supposed to meet with her teacher next week to discuss her progress. She's doing very well in reading but struggles with math. I want to help her, but I work nights and I'm always so tired during the day when she needs help with homework." Moreau felt something twist in his chest at the matter-of-fact way Eleanor described her concerns about her daughter's education, concerns that had been rendered tragically irrelevant 20 years ago when she had died on this highway. Lily Brandt would be 27 years old now, fully grown, having lived her entire adult life without the mother who was sitting in this patrol car worried about helping with math homework. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. The date is not November 18th, 2004. It's November 18th, 2024. 20 years have passed since the night you're remembering." Eleanor turned to look at him with an expression of patient skepticism, the look of someone humoring a person who was clearly confused. "That's not possible. I just left work a few hours ago. My supervisor signed my timesheet. I have it in my purse." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small purse, opening it to show him the timesheet inside. The date at the top read November 18th, 2004, and it bore the signature of a supervisor at Liberty Hospital. Moreau accepted the timesheet and examined it. The paper was not aged or yellowed as one would expect from a document 20 years old. It looked and felt like it had been printed recently, but the date was clearly 2004, and the hospital's logo at the top was the older version that had been replaced with a modernized design sometime in the 2010s. This was either an authentic artifact from 20 years ago that had been impossibly preserved, or it was a reproduction so perfect that it included details no one would think to fake. Headlights appeared in Moreau's rearview mirror, approaching from the south. The vehicle was a state police patrol car, and it pulled up behind Moreau's unit with its emergency lights activated. Sergeant Gideon Lake exited, a tall man in his late 50s with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades working overnight shifts. Moreau got out of his vehicle to brief Lake before introducing him to Eleanor. "Sir, thank you for responding. This is going to sound impossible, but I need you to hear me out." Moreau provided a concise summary of the encounter, from the initial disabled vehicle call through the discovery of the wrecked Honda and his conversation with the woman who claimed to be Eleanor Brandt. Lake listened without interruption, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp with the kind of focused attention that came from years of evaluating whether situations were what they appeared to be. When Moreau finished, Lake was quiet for a moment, looking past him at the wrecked Honda on the shoulder. "I worked the original accident, November 18th, 2004. Single vehicle, left the roadway right about where that wreck is sitting now. The vehicle rolled multiple times. Eleanor Brandt was pronounced dead at the scene by the medical examiner. I personally inventoried her belongings and contacted her next of kin. Her daughter Lily was 7 years old at the time. Sir, the woman in my patrol car believes she is Eleanor Brandt, and she's provided identification and personal effects that appear to support that identity. She has no awareness that 20 years have passed or that she died in an accident. She thinks tonight is the night of November 18th, 2004. Lake walked to Moreau's patrol car and looked through the window at Eleanor. Their eyes met, and Lake's expression changed in a way that was difficult to define. Recognition, perhaps, or the shock of seeing someone he had last seen dead at an accident scene, now sitting in a patrol car looking exactly as she had looked that night. He returned to where Moreau stood and spoke in a voice that was lower and more serious than before. "That's her. That's Eleanor Brandt. I'd recognize her face anywhere. I've thought about that accident more than any other case I've worked. It stayed with me because of the daughter, 7 years old, lost her mother right before the holidays. I remember feeling like we had failed somehow, like if we had just been a little faster, or if the weather had been a little better, maybe we could have prevented it. But you can't change the past, and you learn to live with the cases that haunt you. Sir, what do we do here? I can't process her through normal channels. I can't even begin to document this in a way that would make sense to anyone who wasn't here to witness it." Lake looked back at the wrecked Honda, then up at the fog that continued to swirl through his emergency lights. This stretch of highway has always been strange. We've had more unusual incidents here than anywhere else in the region. Accidents that don't make sense, vehicles found in places they couldn't have gotten to, calls from locations where no one is present. Most of it we write off as equipment failure or human error, but some of us who have worked this road long enough know there's something else going on. Something about this place, maybe the way the mountains channel the fog, maybe something deeper that we don't have words for. The highway remembers things, holds on to them, plays them back on certain nights. Are you saying this is some kind of residual haunting? That Eleanor isn't really here? I'm saying I don't know what she is, but I know that woman in your patrol car looks and sounds exactly like the woman who died on this road 20 years ago tonight. And I know that we're standing here on the anniversary of her death, in the same fog conditions that contributed to her accident, dealing with a situation that has no rational explanation. That's not coincidence." They stood in the cold, the fog pressing in around them, and Moreau felt the weight of a decision that had no good options. If he transported Eleanor to the barracks, What would happen when they tried to verify her identity? Would she simply disappear, fade away like a ghost in daylight? If he left her here, would she continue walking along the highway, eternally replaying the last night of her life, forever trying to get home to a daughter who had grown up without her? "I'm going to talk to her," Lake said. "Maybe she'll respond differently to me. I was there that night. Maybe that connection means something." Lake opened the rear door of Moreau's patrol car and crouched down so he was at eye level with Eleanor. "Ms. Brandt, my name is Gideon Lake. I'm with the New York State Police. I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight." Eleanor looked at him with the same patient cooperation she had shown throughout the encounter. "I told the other officer everything. My car broke down, and I called for help. I just need to get home to my daughter." "Your daughter Lily? She's 7 years old?" "Yes. She just had her birthday last week. She's growing up so fast. I worry about her when I'm at work. She stays with my mother during my shifts, but she misses me. I can tell." Lake's expression softened with something that looked like grief. "Ms. Brandt, Lily is fine. She's safe and she's grown into a wonderful adult. She's 27 years old now. She became a teacher, just like she always talked about wanting to do. She works at an elementary school in Kingston, helps kids learn to read. She's exactly the kind of person you would be proud of." Eleanor stared at Lake with an expression of complete incomprehension. "That's not possible. You're confused. Lily is 7. She's in 2nd grade. She's waiting for me at home." "I know this is difficult to understand, but you're not going home tonight. You can't. The night you're remembering, November 18th, 2004, was the last night of your life. You had an accident on this highway. Your car went off the road right here at mile marker 85. You didn't survive that accident, Eleanor. I'm sorry." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. She looked at Lake, then at Moreau, then out at the wrecked Honda, illuminated in the emergency lights. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was quieter, more distant, as though she was speaking from very far away. "I remember now. The light from the side too bright, and then the car rolling. I remember the impact, the way everything went dark, and then waking up in the fog, walking along the highway thinking I needed to get home. But there is no home anymore, is there? Lily grew up without me. 20 years passed and I wasn't there." "She never forgot you," Lake said gently. "She visits your grave every year on this date, brings flowers and tells you about her life. She became strong and successful because of what you taught her in the 7 years you had together. You did everything a mother could do." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that caught the light from the emergency strobes. "I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to tell her I loved her one last time. She knows. She's always known." Eleanor looked down at her hands, turning them over as though seeing them for the first time and not quite recognizing them as her own. "What happens now? Where do I go?" Lake glanced at Moreau, and in that look passed an understanding that they were navigating something far beyond their training or authority. "I don't know," Lake said honestly. "But I think maybe you've been stuck here, replaying this night, because you never got closure, never got to accept what happened. Maybe, now that you know, now that you understand Lily is okay, you can move on. Move on to where? Wherever people go when they're ready to let go of this world. I can't answer that for you. No one can." Eleanor was quiet for a long time, and as Moreau watched, she seemed to become less solid, less present. It was subtle at first, a slight transparency around the edges, but it grew more pronounced as the seconds passed. She looked at Lake with an expression of profound sadness mixed with something that might have been relief. "Tell her I loved her. Tell Lily I was always proud of her, even if I couldn't be there to see her grow up." "I will," Lake promised. "I'll make sure she knows." Eleanor smiled, and then she was gone. Not fading gradually, but simply absent. The back seat of the patrol car empty, as though no one had ever been sitting there. The child's backpack that had been on the passenger seat was gone too. When Moreau and Lake walked to the wrecked Honda to examine it more closely, they found it had changed. The vehicle was still damaged, still clearly a wreck, but now it looked like what it actually was, a deteriorated hulk that had been sitting abandoned for 2 decades. The interior that had been dusty but intact was now completely ruined by weather and time. The seats rotted, the dashboard warped and cracked. There was no pink backpack on the passenger seat. There was nothing that indicated the vehicle had been occupied recently. Moreau and Lake stood by the wreck in the fog and cold, and neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Lake broke the silence. "I'll handle the paperwork on this. You responded to a disabled vehicle call and found an abandoned wreck. Nothing unusual. We'll have it towed and disposed of properly. That's the official story." "And the unofficial story?" "The unofficial story is that some nights, on certain stretches of highway, the past and present overlap. People who died with unfinished business replay their final moments, trying to find the closure they never got. And sometimes, if you're in the right place at the right time, you can help them find that closure. That's what we did tonight." Moreau wanted to ask more questions, to understand the mechanics of what had happened. But he recognized that some experiences could not be fully explained or understood. They could only be witnessed and acknowledged. He returned to his patrol car and sat in the driver's seat, looking at the empty back seat in his rearview mirror, and felt a profound sadness for Eleanor Brandt, who had died trying to get home to her daughter, and had spent 20 years trapped in that final night, forever walking along the highway in the fog. He radioed dispatch to clear the call and resume patrol. As he drove south on Route 17, leaving the wreck and Lake behind, Moreau thought about the promise Lake had made. To tell Lily that her mother had loved her and been proud of her. It was a small thing, a moment of closure that would hopefully bring peace to both the living daughter and the spirit of the mother who had finally let go. Small things mattered in this work. Sometimes they were all you had. Over the following weeks, Moreau continued his overnight shifts on Route 17, driving through the darkness and fog, responding to the routine calls that filled his patrols. He never encountered Eleanor Brandt again, never received another call from meal marker 84 about a disabled vehicle. The emergency call box at that location was eventually repaired and stopped having false activations. The stretch of highway returned to normal as any road could be that ran through the mountains and had seen its share of tragedy over the years. But Moreau never forgot that night. And sometimes, when the fog was particularly heavy and he was driving past mile marker 85, he would slow down and look at the shoulder where the wrecked Honda had been. And he would wonder if Eleanor had truly found peace, or if some part of her still walked that highway, forever trying to get home to a daughter who had grown up without her. He hoped she had found peace. Hoped that wherever she had gone when she faded from his patrol car, it was somewhere better than the endless repetition of a tragic night. The highway kept its secrets. It always had, and Trooper Silas Moreau kept his own secrets about what he had witnessed, carrying them in silence because some truths were too strange to share, and because the memory of Eleanor Brandt's final smile deserved to remain sacred rather than becoming just another story told in the break room at the barracks. He had helped a lost soul find its way home, and that was enough. That was all the meaning the experience needed.